Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to help you fall asleep. So first like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching now? Make yourself comfortable and relax. I never thought I'd find myself running for my life through the dense Appalachian forest. But then again, I never thought I'd stumble across an illegal marijuana plantation. It's funny how quickly a peaceful hike can turn into a nightmare. The day started like any other on my week-long solo trek. I woke up as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy. Casting dappled shadows on my tent. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I stretched, feeling the satisfying pop of my joints after a night on the hard ground. After a quick breakfast of granola and dried fruit, I packed up my gear and hit the trail. The path wound through the forest, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking views of the mountains beyond. I took my time, stopping often to admire wildflowers or listen to the chorus of birdsong echoing through the trees. Around midday, I decided to venture off the main trail. I'd heard rumors of a beautiful hidden waterfall, and my adventure spirit got the better of me. I pulled out my map and compass, plotting a course through the unmarked wilderness. The going was tough, the underbrush was thick, and I had to push through brambles and hanging branches. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and my shirt clung to my back, but the promise of discovery kept me moving forward. After about an hour of bushwhacking, I noticed something odd. The forest ahead looked different. The trees were more widely spaced, and the undergrowth had been cleared. Curious, I pressed on them. I saw it. My heart almost stopped. Rows and rows of marijuana plants stretched out before me, their distinctive leaves unmistakable. The plants were tall, well-tended, and numerous. This was no small operation. I froze, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. I should have turned back immediately. I should have quietly retraced my steps and pretended I'd never seen anything. But shock and morbid curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. For a few crucial moments, my eyes darted around the clearing, taking in details I wish I'd never noticed. There were irrigation lines running between the rows, a few small sheds at the far end of the field, and worst of all, a pair of men walking between the plants, checking their crop. One of them looked up. Our eyes met across the field, and time seemed to stand still. I saw the surprise on his face quickly morph into anger. He shouted something to his companion and started running towards me. That's when my survival instinct finally kicked in. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear shouts behind me growing closer. By the second, these men knew the terrain far better than I did. I ran blindly, no longer caring about direction or stealth. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that clearing as possible. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. A gunshot rang out, the sound echoing through the trees. I ducked instinctively, nearly losing my footing on the uneven ground. They were shooting at me. This was real. This was happening. I spotted a fallen tree ahead and dove behind it, trying to catch my breath and think I couldn't outrun them forever. I needed a plan. Footsteps crunched on leaves nearby. I held my breath, pressing myself into the damp earth. A voice called out far too close for comfort. "We know you're out there. Come out now, and we won't hurt you." I almost laughed at the obvious lie. They had just shot at me. There was no way I was giving myself up. Another voice, quieter but still audible. "If he makes it to the main trail, he won't." The first voice growled. I closed my eyes, trying to picture the map in my head. If I could make it to the main trail, there might be other hikers, safety, and numbers. But which direction was it? The voices were moving away slightly. It was now or never. I took a deep breath, chose a direction, and ran. I moved as quickly and quietly as I could, which wasn't very quiet at all. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot to my ears. I expected to feel a bullet in my back at any moment. the sound of rushing water reached my ears. The creek, if I could reach it, I could use it to throw off any attempt to track me. I veered towards the sound, hope giving me a second wind. I broke through the tree line and saw the creek below swollen from recent rains. Without hesitation, I half ran, half slid down the steep bank and plunged into the icy water. The shock of cold stole my breath away. The current was stronger than I expected, tugging at my legs as I waded across. By the time I reached the other side, I was soaked and shivering, but feeling a bit more optimistic about my chances. I clambered up the opposite bank, my wet clothes heavy and clinging. As I pulled myself over the edge, a hand grasped my arm. I shouted in terror, trying to pull away, but the grip was like iron. I looked up into the face of a man I hadn't seen before. He must have circled around while his friends chased me. Gotcha, he snarled, yanking me to my feet. I didn't think, I just reacted. My free hand shot out, catching him square in the nose. There was a satisfying crunch, and he let go, howling in pain and surprise. I shoved him hard, and he stumbled backward. His foot caught on a route, and he went down, his head cracking against a rock with a sickening thud. He lay still for a moment. I just stood there panting and staring at his motionless form. Was he dead? Had I killed him? The thought made me sick. Shouts in the distance snapped me back to reality. I couldn't stay here. I took off running again, my wet boots squelching with every step. The trees began to thin out, and suddenly, miraculously, I burst out onto a wide, well-maintained trail, the main hiking path. I could have cried with relief. I turned left, moving as fast as my exhausted legs would carry me. I had to find other people, or the ranger station, or anything resembling civilization. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, I heard voices ahead, normal voices laughing. I rounded a bend and saw a group of day hikers coming towards me. They took one look at my bedraggled appearance and soaking wet, covered in mud and scratches, wild-eyed with panic, and stopped in their tracks. Are you okay? A woman asked, concern evident in her voice. The adrenaline that had been keeping me going suddenly evaporated. My legs gave out, and I sank to the ground, shaking. Call the Rangers. I managed to gasp out, there are men back, their guns. The group sprung into action. One man pulled out a satellite phone and started dialing, while others gathered around me, offering water in a warm jacket. As I sat there waiting for help to arrive, the full weight of what had happened began to sink, and I had stumbled upon something I was never meant to see. I had run for my life, been shot at, and quite possibly seriously injured or killed a man. I closed my eyes, the events replaying in my mind, the serene beauty of the forest. That morning felt like a distant dream. How quickly things had changed, how close I had come to never making it out of those woods. When the Rangers finally arrived, I told them everything. They looked grim as they took notes and called for backup as they loaded me into their truck to take me to safety. One of them patted my shoulder. You're lucky to be alive, son, he said solemnly. We've been trying to locate this operation for months. You've helped us more than you know. I nodded numbly, not feeling particularly lucky or helpful at that moment. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest. From here it looked peaceful, inviting even, but I knew better now. I knew the dangers that could lurk behind that green curtain. I had set out that morning looking for adventure, for a connection with nature. Instead, I had found the darkest side of humanity hidden away in one of the most beautiful places I'd ever seen. As the trees receded in the distance, I made a silent promise to myself I would return to the wilderness one day. I wouldn't let this experience rob me of my love for nature and exploration, but I would be wiser, more cautious, and I would stick to the marked trails. The moment I realized my ID was missing, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. Little did I know that was just the beginning of the longest night of my life. I'd been looking forward to this solo camping trip for months, the daily grind of city life and with its constant noise, an endless stream of people had been wearing me down. I needed an escape, a chance to reconnect with nature and, more importantly, with myself. The first 2 days were everything I'd hoped for. I found a perfect spot by a babbling brook far enough from the main trails that I hadn't seen another soul since I'd arrived. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. At night, the sky was a blanket of stars unobscured by city lights. I felt at peace for the first time in ages. On the third morning, I woke to the sound of birds' song. I stretched, feeling the satisfying pop of my joints after a night on the hard ground. The thin nylon of my tent was bathed in soft morning light, and I smiled, looking forward to another day of hiking and solitude. That's when I noticed something was off. The zipper of my tent was partially open. I frowned, certain I had closed it fully the night before. A quick glance around my small tent showed nothing obviously amiss, but an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and reached for my backpack, intending to grab my toiletries for a quick morning wash in the stream. As I rummaged through the bag, the unease grew. Things weren't where I'd left them. My clothes were jumbled, my food stores disorganized. With growing dread, I searched for the small waterproof pouch where I kept my most important items. It wasn't in its usual spot. I dumped out the contents of my backpack, my movements becoming more frantic. The pouch was nowhere to be found. My hands shook as I ran them through my tangled hair. The pouch contained my ID, my credit cards, and my phone, my only link to the outside world. It was gone. I crawled out of the tent, my eyes scanning the campsite. Maybe I'd taken the pouch out last night and forgotten, but deep down I knew that wasn't the case. I was always careful with my valuables, especially out here in the wilderness. The campsite looked undisturbed at first glance. My small cooking set was still hanging from a tree branch, my water bottles lined up neatly by the fire pit. But then I saw it, a set of footprints in the soft earth near my tent, too large to be my own. Someone had been here, someone had gone through my things while I slept. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't as alone out here as I had thought. The peace and safety I had felt shattered, replaced by a growing panic. I spent the next few hours searching desperately for the missing pouch, hoping against hope that it had simply been misplaced. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, I had to accept the truth. It was gone, along with my only means of communication and identification. I sat by the cold fire pit, trying to think rationally through the fear. I had enough food and water to last a few more days. I knew roughly which direction would take me back to civilization. Even without my map, I could hike out and find help. But the thought of spending another night here, knowing someone had invaded my campsite once, made my skin crawl. I decided to pack up and start hiking out immediately. I could cover a good distance before nightfall. As I was stuffing my sleeping bag into its compression sack, a twig snapped in the woods behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding. The forest looked the same as it always had, sunlight dappling the leaves, a gentle breeze rustling the branches. But now it felt oppressive, full of hidden threats. Hello, I called out, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. There was no response, in just the normal sounds of the forest. I turned back to my packing, my movements now hurried and clumsy. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch twice more. I could have sworn I heard footsteps, but when I looked, there was nothing there. By the time I had everything packed, my nerves were frayed. I shouldered my backpack, took one last look at the campsite that had been my peaceful haven just hours ago, and set off down the trail. The hike was grueling. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. The weight of my pack and the stress of the situation quickly tired me out, but I pushed on, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the campsite as possible. As the afternoon wore on, doubt began to creep in. Was I going the right way? Without my map or phone, I was relying solely on my memory and sense of direction. The trees all started to look the same, the path less and less distinct. The sun was setting by the time I had to admit I was lost. The trail I had been following petered out into nothing, leaving me standing in a small clearing. As the shadows lengthened around me, I was exhausted, scared, and completely turned around. I had no choice but to make camp for the night. With shaking hands, I set up my tent, no longer caring about finding the perfect spot. I didn't bother with a fire, not wanting to draw attention to myself. As full dark settled in, I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight. Sleep was impossible. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified. The hoot of an owl made me gasp. The scurrying of some small animal nearby had me sitting bolt upright. I clutched my small camping knife, the only protection I had, and tried to steady my breathing. It must have been close to midnight when I heard its footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my tent. I froze, not daring to breathe. The footsteps paused, then started again, closer this time. A shadow fell across the tent wall. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it must be audible. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but terror kept me paralyzed. A hand brushed against the tent, tracing a line down the nylon. I bit my lip to keep from whimpering. "I know you're in there," a voice said, low and growly. "Why don't you come on out? We need to have a little chat." I remained silent, my mind racing. Who was this person? What did they want? The zipper of my tent began to move slowly, inching upward. I gripped my knife tighter, knowing it would be little defense against whoever was out there. But it was all I had. Just as the zipper reached the halfway point, a new sound cut through the night. Voices distant but drawing closer. Flashlight beams bounced through the trees. The hand withdrew from my tent as if burned. I heard a muttered curse, then the sound of someone crashing away through the underbrush. "Hello," a new voice called out. "Forest Service, is anyone there?" Relief flooded through me, so intense it left me lightheaded. I scrambled out of the tent. "Here," I shouted, my voice cracking. "I'm here." Two rangers emerged into the clearing, their flashlights blinding after them. Darkness, they looked from me to my hastily erected tent with concern. "Are you all right, miss?" one asked, taking in my disheveled appearance and wild eyes. The whole story came pouring out of me. Then the missing pouch, the footsteps, the terrifying encounter just moments ago. The rangers listened, gravely exchanging glances. "You're not the first," the older ranger said. When I'd finished, "We've had reports of someone stalking campers in this area. That's why we're out here tonight. You're lucky we came along when we did." Lucky. The words seemed inadequate to describe how I felt. The rangers escorted me back to their station, where I gave a formal statement. They arranged for a ride back to the city for me the next day, after I'd had a chance to rest in the safety of the station. As I lay on the small cot they provided, finally feeling safe enough to sleep, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly things had changed in the span of a day. The forest had transformed from a peaceful sanctuary to a place of terror. I knew it would be a long time before I felt comfortable camping again. If ever the memory of those footsteps, that voice in the darkness, would stay with me. But I was alive, I had survived, and as the first light of dawn began to filter through the station windows, I made a promise to myself I wouldn't let this experience defeat me. One day I would return to the wilderness, but next time I wouldn't be alone. The moment I saw the men with rifles through my camera lens, I knew I was in trouble. What I didn't know was how quickly my peaceful wildlife expedition would turn into a desperate fight for survival. I've always been passionate about wildlife, photographed raw. Why, there's something magical about capturing the raw beauty of nature. Freezing moments that most people never get to see. That's what brought me to this remote corner of the Alaskan wilderness, miles from the nearest town, and even further from anything resembling civilization. I'd been out here for nearly 2 weeks, my tent a temporary home amidst the towering pines and rugged landscape. The solitude was blissful, broken only by the calls of birds and the occasional rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. Each day I'd wake with the sun, eager to see what new wonders I might capture through my lens. On this particular morning, I set out just as the first rays of sunlight were painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. I had a specific location in mind, a small clearing where I'd set up some trail cameras a few days prior. I was hoping to get some shots of the local wolf pack that I knew passed through the area. The hike was invigorating, the crisp morning air filling my lungs as I carefully picked my way along the faint trail. The weight of my camera gear was familiar and comforting on my back as I neared the clearing. I slowed my pace, moving as quietly as possible to avoid startling any wildlife. I reached the edge of the clearing and crouched down, surveying the area before entering. That's when I saw them, 3 men dressed in camouflage, carrying high-powered rifles. They were gathered around something on the ground, something large. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was seeing: a wolf, its magnificent silver coat now stained red. These weren't hunters, this was poaching, plain and simple. Without thinking, I raised my camera and started shooting. The telephoto lens brought the scene into sharp focus: the men's faces, the guns, the dead wolf evidence. My heart was pounding, but my hand remained steady, years of practice taking over. I was so focused on capturing the scene that I didn't notice one of the men look up. Didn't see him nudge his companions and point in my direction. It wasn't until I heard the shout that I realized my mistake. "Hey, you there!" I dropped to the ground, but it was too late. They'd seen me. Panic surged through me as I heard them start to move in my direction. I scrambled backward, staying low, then turned and ran. The forest that had seemed so peaceful just moments ago now felt oppressive, full of obstacles trying to trip me up. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, the sound of pursuit behind me spurring me on. I ran without direction, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and the poachers as possible. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but fear kept me moving. I could hear them shouting to each other, their voices too close for comfort. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the trees onto a rocky slope. I paused for a moment, gasping for breath, trying to get my bearings. That's when I heard the gunshot. The crack of the rifle echoed through the valley, followed by the whine of a bullet passing far too close. They were shooting at me. This wasn't about scaring me off anymore. They meant to silence me permanently. I dove behind a large boulder, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. What had I gotten myself into? I was no action hero, just a wildlife photographer who'd stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. Another shot rang out, chips of rock exploding from the boulder next to my head. I needed to move to find better cover. My eyes darted around, looking for an escape route. The slope continued upward, becoming steeper and rockier. It would be difficult terrain, but it might slow my pursuer down. Taking a deep breath, I sprinted from behind the boulder, zigzagging as I climbed. More shots followed, but the uneven ground seemed to throw off their aim. I didn't look back, focusing all my energy on the climb. I reached a small ledge and allowed myself a moment's rest, pressing myself against the rock face. The shouts of the men were more distant now, but still too close for comfort. I knew I couldn't keep this pace up for long. I needed a plan. That's when I remembered my satellite phone safely tucked away in my backpack. If I could just find a moment to make a call to alert the authorities. But first, I needed to find a safe spot. I continued my climb, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The terrain became increasingly difficult, requiring all my concentration to navigate safely. The voices of my pursuers faded, replaced by the sound of my own labored breathing and pounding heart. Finally, I reached a small cave-like opening in the rock face. It wasn't deep, but it offered some shelter and a place to catch my breath. I squeezed inside, wincing as my camera bag scraped against the rock. I'd forgotten I was still carrying it, the instinct to protect my gear ingrained after years of field work. With shaking hands, I unzipped my backpack and pulled out the satellite phone. As I went to turn it on, my heart sank. The screen remained dark, dead battery. I'd been so caught up in my photography over the past few days that I'd forgotten to charge it. A wave of despair washed over me. I was alone, being hunted by armed men, with no way to call for help. For a moment, I considered giving up. Maybe if I surrendered, explained that I'd delete the photos. No, I couldn't take that risk. These men had already shown they were willing to kill. I had to keep going, had to find a way out of this. I allowed myself a few more minutes of rest, then reluctantly left the safety of my rocky shelter. The sun was high in the sky now, the heat making my clothes stick to my skin with sweat. I needed to find water soon, or dehydration would become as much of a threat as the poachers. I continued moving, sticking to areas with more cover. Every snapping twig made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Hours passed this way, the strain of constant vigilance taking its toll. As the light began to fade, I knew I needed to find a place to spend the night. The thought of being out here in the dark, knowing those men were still looking for me, made my skin crawl. But I had no choice. I found a dense thicket of bushes and crawled inside, ignoring the scratches from the branches. It wasn't comfortable, but it offered some concealment. I curled up, trying to make myself as small as possible. Sleep was impossible. Every sound had me tensing, expecting to see the barrel of a gun poking through the leaves. I clutched my camera bag to my chest, the evidence it contained feeling more like a curse than an asset. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the leaves, I heard a new sound, a rhythmic thudding that grew louder by the second. I held my breath, not daring to move. The sound grew to a roar, and suddenly a large shape passed overhead, a helicopter. My heart leapt. Someone was looking for me. I burst out of my hiding place, waving my arms frantically. The helicopter circled back, hovering lower. I could see the words Forest Service emblazoned on its side as it landed in a nearby clearing. I felt a wave of relief, so strong it nearly brought me to my knees. Park rangers poured out, rushing to my side. Their questions washed over me. In a blur, was I hurt? Were the men still in the area? Did I need medical attention? I managed to stammer out my story, showing them the photos on my camera. Their faces grew grave as they realized the extent of what I'd uncovered. One of the rangers, an older man with kind eyes, placed a hand on my shoulder. "You've been incredibly brave," he said, "but you're safe now. We'll take care of everything from here." As they led me to the helicopter, I took one last look at the wilderness around me. It was as beautiful as ever, the morning sun painted the landscape in soft light. But now I knew the darkness that could lurk in even the most beautiful places. I was alive, I had survived, and I had the evidence to bring those poachers to justice. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying me back to safety, I made a silent promise to myself. I would return to the wild. I wouldn't let this experience rob me of my passion, but next time I'd be better prepared, more cautious, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit braver. The moment the stranger emerged from the shadows, his eyes wild and his smile too wide, I knew our peaceful camping trip had taken a sinister turn. Little did we know he wasn't alone, and our night was about to become a desperate struggle for survival. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just me, my best friend Alex, and his girlfriend Mia, escaping the chaos of city life for a few days of fresh air and starry skies. We'd found this perfect spot tucked away way in a quiet corner of the national forest, far from the crowded campgrounds and noisy RV parks. The first day had been everything we'd hoped, for we'd hiked through dew-dappled forests, marveled at sparkling waterfalls, and laughed around the campfire as we roasted marshmallows and shared stories. As the embers of our fire died down and the night deepened, we crawled into our tents, tired but content. I was jolted awake by the sound of twigs snapping nearby. At first, I thought it might be an Animal, maybe a curious raccoon drawn by the lingering scent of our dinner, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold, whistling a jaunty, off-key tune that had no place in the dead of night. In the middle of the woods I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. The whistling grew louder, punctuated by the crunch of leaves underfoot. Someone was walking through our campsite. Hello there, campers, a voice called out, far too cheerful for the hour. Anyone awake? I heard Alex stirring in the tent next to mine. What the hell? He mumbled hesitantly. I unzipped my tent and poked my head out. The sight that greeted me was unsettling, to say the least. A man stood in the center of our campsite, illuminated by the pale moonlight. He was tall and lanky, dressed in ragged clothes that had seen better days. His beard was white, wild, and unkempt, and his eyes, there was something not quite right about them. They were too wide, too bright, darting around with an unnerving intensity. There you are, he exclaimed, grinning at me. I was starting to think you all might be dead, and there wouldn't that have been a shame. Alex emerged from his tent, Mia close behind him. I could see the confusion and unease on their faces, mirroring my own. Can we help you with something? Alex asked, his voice cautious. The stranger's grin widened. Oh, I'm sure you can. I'm Daniel, by the way. I couldn't help but notice your lovely little setup here. Looks cozy. He took a step closer, and we instinctively backed away. Thing is, he continued, it's not safe out here. All sorts of dangers in these woods. I've got a much better spot, nice and secure. Why don't you all come with me? Alarm bells were ringing in my head. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that we needed to get away from this man as quickly as possible. Thanks for the offer, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But we're fine here. We'll be heading out in the morning anyway. Daniel's smile faltered for a moment, a flash of something dark crossing his face. I really think you should reconsider. It's not a request, you see, it's more of a strong suggestion. That's when we heard it rustling in the bushes around our campsite, more footsteps coming from all directions. My heart began to race as dark figures emerged from the trees, forming a loose circle around us. Oh God, Mia whispered, grabbing Alex's arm. There were 5 of the men and women, all with the same wild, desperate look as Daniel. They were dressed in a mishmash of outdoor gear and tattered clothes, and I spotted at least 2 knives among them. Now then, Daniel said, his voice losing its forced cheerfulness, let's try this again. You're coming with us, unless you prefer to take your chances out here. Alex stepped forward, putting himself between the strangers and Mia. Look, we don't want any trouble. Just take what you want and leave us alone. One of the other men, a burly guy with a shaved head, laughed harshly. What we want is you, city boy. Now move your asses before we have to get rough. My mind was racing. We were outnumbered and unarmed, save for a small camping knife in my tent. Even if we could get to our car, they had us surrounded. Running into the dark woods would be suicide. Okay, I said, raising my hands in a pleading gesture. Okay, we'll come with you. Just give us a minute to grab our things. Daniel nodded, that unsettling grin back on his face. Smart choice, but don't try anything stupid. We'll be watching. With shaking hands, we began to gather our belongings. As I ducked into my tent, I managed to slip the camping knife into my pocket without being noticed. It wasn't much, but it was something. They marched us through the forest, deeper into the wilderness. The moon had vanished behind the clouds, leaving us in near total darkness. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the group's rough hands shoving me forward whenever I slowed. After what felt like hours, we arrived at a clearing. Crude shelters made of tarps and branches were scattered around, and a large fire pit dominated the center. It looked like they'd been living out here for a while. Welcome home, Daniel said, spreading his arms wide. Well, you're home for now anyway. They guided us towards one of the shelters, a ramshackle lean that smelled of damp earth and mold. As they pushed us inside, I caught Alex's eye. A silent understanding passed between us. We needed to find a way out of this, and soon the next few hours were a blur of fear and tension. Our captors took turns guarding us, their eyes never leaving the entrance to our makeshift prison. I could hear them arguing amongst themselves, though their voices were too low to make out the words, as dawn began to break, casting a pale light through the gaps in our shelter. I felt a tap on my shoulder. Alex nodded towards the back of the lean to where a section of the covering had come loose. It wasn't much, but it might be enough for us to slip through. We waited, hearts pounding, for the right moment. When the guard's attention wavered for just a second, distracted by something in the camp, we made our move. I went first, wriggling through the gap as quietly as I could. The rough edge of the branches scraped my skin, but I barely felt it. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins. Every sense hyper alert. Alex came next, then helped Mia through. We crouched in the underbrush, hardly daring to breathe. The camp was stirring, early risers moving about, but no one had noticed our escape yet. Which way? Mia whispered, her voice trembling. I pointed in the direction I thought we'd come from the night before. We'd have to risk it. Staying here wasn't an option. We began to move slowly at first, then faster, as we put distance between ourselves and the camp. The forest was alive with morning sounds, bird song, rustling leaves, the chattering of squirrels. It all faded into background noise, drowned out by the pounding of my heart and our ragged breathing. We'd been running for maybe 10 minutes when we heard the first shout. They discovered we were gone. Faster, Alex gasped, grabbing Mia's hand and pulling her along. I could hear them crashing through the forest behind us, their angry voices carrying on the wind. They knew these was better than we did, and they were gaining on us up ahead. I spotted a break in the trees. As we burst out of the forest, my heart sank. We were at the edge of a steep ravine, a churning river far below. We're trapped, Mia said, panic evident in her voice. The sounds of pursuit grew louder. We had seconds at most before they caught up to us. I looked at the raging water below, then back at my friends. It was a terrible choice, but it was the only one we had. We have to jump, I said. Alex's eyes widened in disbelief, but then understanding dawned on his face. He nodded grimly. On three, he said, gripping Mia's hand tightly. 1, 2, 2. There. Daniel's voice rang out behind us. 3. We leapt just as our pursuers broke through the tree line. For a moment, we were flying, the wind rushing past us. Then we hit the water, and the world dissolved into a maelstrom of churning currents and desperate gasps for air. I don't know how long we were in the river. It felt like hours. Why? But it was probably only minutes. Eventually, the current slowed enough for us to make our way to the shore, coughing and sputtering as we dragged ourselves onto the rocky bank. I looked back up at the ravine. There was no sign of Daniel or his group. We'd made it. We were battered, bruised, and soaked to the bone, but we were alive, and we were free. The trek back to civilization was long and arduous, but fueled by the lingering fear of being found, we pushed on. When we finally reached a ranger station and told our story, the look of shock on the ranger's face told us just how lucky we'd been in. The days that followed, as we gave statements to the police and tried to process what had happened, one thing became clear: our simple camping trip had turned into a nightmare. But it had also shown us just how strong we could be when pushed to our limits. I know I'll go camping again someday. The call of the wild is too strong to resist, but I'll never again take the peace and safety of the wilderness for granted, because now I know that sometimes the most dangerous predators in the forest walk on two legs. The moment I heard the voices drifting across the still water, I knew my solitary canoe trip had taken a sinister turn. What I didn't know was how quickly my peaceful retreat would become a desperate fight for survival. I'd always been a bit of a loner, preferring the company of nature to the chaos of the city. That's why I decided to take a week-long canoe trip through the boundary waters of Minnesota. Just me, my canoe, and miles of pristine wilderness stretching out in every direction. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. I paddled through crystal-clear lakes, portaged across rugged trails, and slept under a canopy of stars so bright it took my breath away. The solitude was intoxicating a balm for my stressor soul. On the fourth day, I found the perfect campsite, a small rocky island in the middle of a large lake. It was barely big enough for my tent, but it offered an unobstructed view in all directions. As I set up camp, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was why I come out here. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, I noticed something odd. A canoe far off on the distant shore. It wasn't unusual to see other paddlers out here, but something about this one caught my attention. It was moving erratically, zigzagging along the shoreline as if searching for something. I watched it for a while through my binoculars. Curiosity piqued. There were two men in the canoe, both wearing dark clothing. They seemed to be arguing, gesturing angrily at each other in the shoreline. Eventually, they pulled up to a small cove and disappeared into the trees. I shrugged it off, turning my attention back to setting up my camp for the night. But as darkness fell, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. Something about those men hadn't seemed right. I was jolted awake in the middle of the night by the sound of voices carrying across the water. At first, I thought I was dreaming out here. The only nighttime sounds should have been loons calling and waves lapping at the shore. But as I listened, the voices became clearer. It has to be around here somewhere. One voice said, gruff and impatient, we've been searching for hours. Another replied, maybe we should wait until daylight. I held my breath, straining to hear more. Were these the same men I'd seen earlier? What were they looking for? A beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the water. They were using a spotlight, methodically searching the shoreline. I ducked down, grateful for the small size of my island. In the dark, it would be easy to miss. As I lay there, heart pounding, I ran through possible scenarios in my mind. Maybe they were just fellow campers who had lost something, but the late hour, the secretive behavior, it all pointed to something more sinister. The voices grew closer, and I risked peeking out of my tent. I could see their canoe now, a dark shape gliding silently across the moonlit water. They were heading straight for my island. Panic surged through me. I had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. My little island suddenly felt like a prison. I scrambled to gather my most important gear, my emergency radio, water filter, and a small bag of trail mix. With shaking hands, I shoved them into a dry bag and slipped into the water on the far side of the island, using my tent as cover. The water was shockingly cold, and I had to bite my lip to keep from gasping. I submerged myself up to my neck, clinging to a rocky outcropping. As I watched the canoe approach, it bumped against the shore of my island, and two men climbed out in the moonlight. I could see them more clearly now. They were rough-looking, with unkempt beards and clothes that had seen better days. One carried a spotlight, the other a large duffel bag. Check the tent. The man with the spotlight ordered his companion unzip my tent and ducked inside. Empty, he reported, but still warm. Someone was here recently. Damn it, the first man swore. Oh, where could they have gone? They began to search the island, which didn't take long given its small size. I pressed myself closer to the rocks, praying they wouldn't think to look in the water. The cold was seeping into my bones, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay submerged without starting to shiver uncontrollably. As they completed their search, I overheard snippets of their conversation. Words like stash, border, and patrol floated across the water. With a sinking feeling, I realized what I had stumbled upon: drug smugglers using the remote wilderness to move their product across the Canadian border. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the men returned to their canoe. He couldn't have gone far. One said, let's check the next island over. I watched as they paddled away, their voices fading into the night. Only when I was sure they were gone did I allow myself to climb out of the water, my limbs stiff and aching from the cold. I knew I couldn't stay here. They would likely return to search again, and next time I might not be so lucky. But I also knew that trying to paddle away in the dark would be dangerous, if not impossible. I was trapped with no other choice. I gathered what gear I could and retreated to the densest patch of undergrowth on the island. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I huddled there wet and miserable. As the night wore on, every sound made me flinch. The splash of a fish, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I kept expecting to see the beam of their spotlight cutting through the darkness again, but as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I was still alone. As soon as it was light enough to see, I broke camp as quickly and quietly as I could. I loaded my canoe, constantly scanning the lake for any sign of the men. The morning mist hung low over the water, providing some cover, but also making it hard to see very far. I set off paddling hard. I knew I needed to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible, but I also knew that out on the open water, I would be exposed and vulnerable. If they spotted me for hours, I paddled, my muscles screaming in protest every time I heard the faint sound of a motor or saw a shape move through the mist. I would duck into a cove or behind an island, heart racing. It was mid-afternoon when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a canoe cutting through water. I peered around the edge of the small island I'd been using for cover and saw them, the two men paddling hard, scanning the lake. They were following my trail. I ducked back, mind racing. I couldn't outrun them. They were fresher, and their canoe was lighter. Without all the camping gear, I needed another plan. That's when I spotted it, a narrow channel leading into a maze of small islands and shallow reefs. It would be tricky to navigate, especially in a loaded canoe, but I knew it was my only chance. Taking a deep breath, I pushed off and made a break for the channel. Almost immediately, I heard shouts behind me. They'd spotted me. What followed was the most intense paddling of my life. I weaved through the channel, scraping over hidden rocks and squeezing through gaps barely wider than my canoe. All the while, I could hear them behind me, their curses echoing off the rocky shores. As they struggled to follow, I was running on pure adrenaline, every muscle straining as I pushed myself to the limit. I knew that one wrong turn, one mistake could mean the difference between escape and capture. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the maze into open water in the distance. I could see buildings, a ranger station on the edge of the boundary waters. With a final surge of energy, I paddled towards it. I could still hear the men behind me, but their voices were fainter now, that they wouldn't dare follow me to the ranger station. As I pulled up to the dock, legs shaking so badly I could barely stand, a ranger came out to meet me. One look at my face must have told him something was wrong. "Are you all right?" he asked, helping me out of the canoe. The whole story came pouring out of me. Then the suspicious men, the midnight search, my desperate flight through the wilderness. The ranger listened gravely, then immediately radioed for backup. In the days that followed, as I gave statements to the police and tried to process what had happened, one thing became clear: my peaceful canoe trip had turned into a nightmare, but it had also shown me just how strong I could be when pushed to my limits. I know I'll return to the boundary waters someday. The beauty of that wilderness is too powerful to resist, but I'll never again take the solitude for granted, because now I know that even in the most remote places, darkness can find you. And when it does, you have to be ready to fight with everything you have. The moment I saw the fresh footprints in the dust of the abandoned cabin, I knew we weren't alone. What I didn't know was how quickly our curiosity would turn into a fight for survival. It was supposed to be a simple weekend hike, just me and Sarah. We'd been dating for a few months, and this was our first real getaway together. Both of us loved the outdoors, and the promise of exploring an old logging trail in the Cascades seemed like the perfect adventure. The weather was perfect that Saturday morning as we set off, the late summer sun warming our backs as we trudged up the overgrown trail. Sarah was a few paces ahead of me, her blonde ponytail swinging in rhythm with her steps. I found myself smiling, feeling lucky to be here with her. We've been hiking for about 3 hours. When we first saw the cabin, it was nestled in a small clearing half hidden by the encroaching forest. The wooden structure looked ancient, its walls weathered gray by countless seasons. "Hey, check that out," I called to Sarah, pointing towards the cabin. She turned, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Oh wow, I wonder how old it is." We approached cautiously, our eyes scanning the area for any signs of recent activity. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years, with vines creeping up the walls and a thick layer of pine needles coating the sagging roof. "Should we take a look inside?" Sarah asked, a hint of excitement in her voice. I hesitated. Something about the cabin made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. "I don't know, it might not be safe." But Sarah was already moving towards the door, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Come on, just a quick peek. Where's your sense of adventure?" Sighing, I followed her up the creaky wooden steps to the porch. The door was slightly ajar, and Sarah pushed it open with a dramatic creak that echoed through the trees. The interior of the cabin was dim, shafts of dusty sunlight filtering through the grimy windows. It was a single room with an old iron stove in one corner and a crude wooden table in the center. A ladder led up to a small loft area. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I noticed something odd. There were fresh marks in the thick dust on the floor. "Footprints, Sarah," I said, my voice low. "I don't think we're alone out here." She turned to look where I was pointing, her eyes widening as she saw the prints. "Maybe it's just other hikers," she suggested, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. I shook my head. "The trail's been empty all day. And look, those prints lead to the loft." We both looked up at the dark opening above us. For a moment, the cabin was utterly silent. Then we heard a faint shuffling sound from above. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "We need to go," she whispered. I nodded, already backing towards the door. But before we could reach it, a figure appeared at the top of the ladder. A man, his face hidden in shadow, was looking down at us. Well, he said, his voice growly and menacing. "What do we have here?" My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear over the rush of blood in my ears. I pushed Sarah behind me towards the door. "We're sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We didn't know anyone was here. We'll leave now." The man chuckled, a sound devoid of any real humor. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that. You see, you've stumbled into something you weren't supposed to see." As he spoke, he began to descend the ladder in the dim light. I could see he was wearing dirty, ragged clothes. His beard was unkempt, and his eyes had a wild, dangerous look to them. Sarah tugged at my arm. "Run," she hissed. We bolted for the door. But as we reached the porch, 2 more men emerged from the trees. They were similarly disheveled, and one was holding a wicked-looking hunting knife. "Going somewhere?" the knife wielder asked, grinning to reveal yellowed teeth. We were trapped. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. The man from the loft had reached the bottom of the ladder and was advancing towards us. "Listen," I said, holding up my hands in what I hoped was a calming gesture. "We don't want any trouble. We won't say anything about what we've seen here. Just let us go." The man with the knife laughed. "Oh, I'm sure you won't say anything. We'll make sure of that." Sarah whimpered beside me, and I felt a surge of protective anger. Without thinking, I grabbed the old iron poker from beside the stove and swung it at the nearest man. He ducked, but the distraction was enough. I shoved Sarah towards the door. "Run," I yelled. We burst out of the cabin, the shouts of the men close behind us. We sprinted into the forest, branches whipping at our faces. As we crashed through the underbrush, I could hear them pursuing us, their angry voices carrying through the trees. Sarah was just ahead of me, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I knew we couldn't outrun them for long. They knew these woods far better than we did. "This way," I gasped, grabbing Sarah's hand and veering off the trail. I'd spotted a dense thicket, and I hoped it might offer us some cover. We dove into the bushes, thorns scratching our skin as we burrowed in as deep as we could. I pulled Sarah close, both of us trying to quiet our breathing. As we heard our pursuers approaching, where they go, one of them shouted, "They can't have gotten far," another replied, "Spread out and find them." We lay there barely daring to breathe. As the men searched the area, I could see glimpses of them through the leaves, moving back and forth, frustration growing in their voices. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, their voices began to fade. They were moving away further into the forest. "I think they're gone," Sarah whispered. I nodded, but gestured for her to stay quiet. We waited a few more minutes, straining our ears for any sound of the men returning. Finally, when I was as sure as I could be that the coast was clear, we carefully extracted ourselves from the thicket. We were scratched and bruised, our clothes torn, but we were alive. "We need to get back to the car," I said, trying to orient myself in our panic. "We've run quite a way off the trail." Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. "Which way?" I looked around, trying to remember the route we'd taken. The fur looked different now, more menacing. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. "I think this way," I said, pointing. I hoped I sounded more confident than I felt. We set off, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. Every snapping twig made us flinch, every rustle in the undergrowth had us freezing in place. The forest that had seemed so beautiful this morning now felt like a green prison. After what felt like an eternity of tense hiking, we finally spotted a familiar landmark, a distinctive bent tree we'd passed on our way up. Relief flooded through me as I realized we were on the right track. "We're close," I told Sarah, squeezing her hand. But our relief was short-lived. As we rounded a bend in the trail, we came face to face with one of our pursuers. He looked as surprised to see us as we were to see him. For a moment, we all stood frozen. Then Sarah reacted, grabbing a large branch from the ground and swinging it at the man's head. It connected with a sickening thud, and he went down. "Run!" Sarah yelled, and we took off down the trail. We could hear shouts behind us as the man's companions discovered him, but we had a head start now, and desperation lent speed to our feet. Finally, mercifully, we burst out of the tree line into the parking area where we'd left our car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the lock. Just as I heard the sound of pursuit breaking through the trees, we tumbled into the car. I started the engine, and floored gravel sprang as we peeled out of the lot. In the rear view mirror, I could see the men emerging from the forest, their faces twisted with rage, but they were getting smaller, more distant with every second we'd made. We drove in silence for a while, both of us trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't until we were back on the main highway that Sarah spoke. "Well, what do you think they were doing out there?" she asked, her voice shaky. I shook my head. "I don't know, nothing good. Maybe they were cooking meth or hiding out from the law. Either way, I'm just glad we got away." Sarah nodded, reaching over to take my hand. "Me too. I've never been so scared in my life." As the miles rolled by, putting more and more distance between us and that nightmare in the woods, I found myself reflecting on how quickly things had changed. What had started as a pleasant hike had turned into a terrifying fight for survival. I knew we'd need to report what had happened to the authorities. Those men were dangerous, and who knew how many other unsuspecting hikers might stumble into their trap. But for now, I was just grateful to be alive, grateful to be here with Sarah. Heading home, the forest had shown us its darker side today, a reminder that even in the most beautiful places, danger can lurk just out of sight. I squeezed Sarah's hand, feeling a newfound appreciation for her strength and quick thinking. We'd face this together, and somehow we'd made it through whatever came next. I knew we'd face it together too. As we drove on towards home and safety, I made a silent promise to myself I'd return to the mountains someday. I wouldn't let this experience rob me of my love for the wilderness. But next time I'd be more prepared, more vigilant, because now I knew that sometimes the most dangerous things in the forest walk on two legs. The moment I found the first note pinned to a tree near my campsite, I knew my peaceful research trip had taken a sinister turn. What I didn't realize was how quickly it would escalate into a terrifying game of cat and mouse in the wilderness. I'd come to the Adra to study the impact of climate change on high-altitude flora. It was supposed to be a month-long solo expedition, just me and the mountains. I'd done trips like this before, and always relished the solitude that chanced to immerse myself in nature without distractions. The first week was exactly what I'd hoped for. I set up a base camp in a small clearing close to a babbling brook that provided fresh water. Each day I'd hike to different elevations, meticulously documenting plant species and taking soil samples. The work was engrossing, and the scenery was breathtaking. In the evenings I'd return to my tent, record my findings, and fall asleep to the gentle sounds of the forest. It was on the 8th day that everything changed. I was returning from a particularly grueling hike when I spotted something out of place, a scrap of paper attached to a pine tree near my tent. Curious, I approached and pulled it free. The message, written in messy scrawl, sent a chill down my spine. "I see you." I looked around, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The forest that had felt so welcoming now seemed oppressive, full of hidden threats. I told myself it was probably just some hiker playing a prank, but a nagging doubt lingered in the back of my mind. I slept fitfully that night, starting at every sound. The next morning, I contemplated packing up and leaving, but the thought of abandoning my research over what might be a harmless joke seemed ridiculous. So I stayed, though I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. As I worked, 2 days passed without incident, and I started to relax. Maybe it had been a one-off thing after all. But when I returned to camp on the 3rd day, my blood ran cold. Another note, this time pinned to my tent: "You shouldn't be here." Fear gripped me. This was no longer a prank. Someone was watching me, stalking me through the wilderness. But why? What did they want? I grabbed my satellite phone, intending to call for help, only to find it was dead. Panic surged through me as I realized the battery had been removed. Whoever was doing this had been in my tent, had gone through my things. I needed to leave immediately, but as I started to pack up my gear, a terrifying thought struck me. What if they were out there right now, watching me? Would they try to stop me if I attempted to hike out? As if in answer to my unspoken question, I heard a twig snap in the woods behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. The forest suddenly felt alive with menace, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. I made a split-second decision. Grabbing only my backpack with some essential supplies, I took off down the trail, leaving the rest of my gear behind. I had to get back to civilization, to safety. The hike out should have taken about 6 hours, but as darkness fell, I realized with growing dread that I was lost. In my panic, I must have taken a wrong turn. The trail I was on was becoming less distinct, overgrown in places. I was in a part of the forest I didn't recognize. As the last light faded from the sky, I was forced to stop. Hiking in the dark would be too dangerous. I found a small hollow beneath a large oak tree and huddled there, too terrified to sleep. Every sound made me flinch: the hoot of an owl, the scurrying of some small animal, the wind whistling through the trees. But worse than the sounds were the silences. When I strained my ears for any hint of approach, dawn found me exhausted and on edge. As I crawled out of my makeshift shelter, my heart nearly stopped there. Pinned to the trunk of the oak tree was another note: "You can't hide." They had found me in the night. They had been close enough to leave a note, while I huddled unaware, mere feet away. The realization sent a wave of nausea through me. I started running, then all attempts at stealth abandoned. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me. I had no idea if I was going in the right direction, but I knew I couldn't stay still. Hours passed in a blur of terror and exhaustion. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but still I pushed on. As the day wore on, I began to hear things: twigs snapping, leaves rustling, always behind me, always just out of sight. Was I being pursued, or was my fear-addled mind playing tricks on me? As the sun began to set for the second time since my flight began, I stumbled upon an old fire tower. It loomed above the trees, a metal skeleton against the darkening sky. With no better options, I began to climb. The metal rungs were slick with dew, and my trembling hands made the ascent treacherous. But finally, I reached the small room at the top. It was empty, abandoned long ago, but it had a door that locked. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. I huddled in a corner of the tiny room, watching as night fell over the forest. From up here, I could see for miles in every direction. Surely, I thought I would be able to spot anyone approaching. As the hours crawled by, my exhaustion began to overtake my fear. Despite my best efforts, I felt my eyelids growing heavy. I drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with nightmares of faceless pursuers. I awoke with a start, unsure how long I'd been asleep. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to lighten the sky, and there, propped against the far wall of the room, was a piece of paper that hadn't been there when I fell asleep. With shaking hands, I unfolded it. "Look behind you." I whirled around, a scream caught in my throat, but there was no one there, just the door still locked from the inside. How was this possible? Whoever was doing this, they weren't just tracking me. They were toying with me, enjoying my terror. In that moment, something in me snapped. The fear that had been driving me for days transformed into a cold, hard anger. I was done running, done being a victim. It was time to turn the tables. I spent the day in the tower, conserving my energy, planning. I took stock of my supplies, fashioned a crude weapon from a broken piece of the tower's railing. As night fell, I began my descent, moving as quietly as I could. I began to backtrack, following my own trail from the day before. If my stalker had been following me, perhaps I could catch them unawares. For hours, I crept through the darkened forest, every sense on high alert. The night was alive with sounds, but I forced myself to move steadily, purposefully. I would not be the prey any longer. It was nearing dawn when I saw it, a faint glow through the trees, a campfire. My heart raced as I approached, moving from tree to tree for cover. And then I saw him, a man sitting by the fire, writing something on a piece of paper. Even from a distance, I recognized the messy scrawl. Rage flooded through me. This was the person who had terrorized me, who had turned my peaceful research trip into a nightmare. Without conscious thought, I found myself moving towards him, my makeshift weapon raised. He must have heard something, because he looked up suddenly, his eyes widening in shock. As he saw me, he scrambled to his feet. But it was too late. What happened next was a blur. There was a struggle, shouts echoing through the pre-dawn forest. When it was over, I stood over him, breathing heavily, my improvised club still gripped tightly in my hand. He was alive, but unconscious. As the adrenaline faded, I began to shake uncontrollably. What had I done? What should I do now? In the end, I used some rope from his own supplies to tie him up. Then, using his satellite phone, functional unlike my own sabotage one, I called for help. The authorities arrived a few hours later. As it turned out, the man was wanted for a series of similar incidents in other parks. He'd get the help he clearly needed, and I had a lot to process. As I sat in the back of a ranger's truck, a shock blanket around my shoulders, I looked out at the forest. It was beautiful in the morning light, peaceful even, but I knew I'd never see it the same way again. I'd come to the wilderness seeking solitude and scientific discovery. Instead, I'd found terror and ultimately a strength I never knew I possessed. The forest had changed me for better or worse. And as we drove away, leaving the trees behind, I knew that someday I'd have to return to face my fears, to reclaim the peace I'd lost, but not today. Today I was going home. The moment the strangers' emergency from the darkness, their eyes glinting in the fur light, I knew our family camping trip had taken a terrifying turn. What I didn't realize was how quickly we'd be fighting for our lives in the wilderness we once thought of as a peaceful escape. It was supposed to be a perfect getaway. My wife Lisa and our two kids Emma 14 and Tyler 10 had been planning this camping trip for months. We'd found a secluded spot in the national forest far from the crowded campgrounds and noisy RVs, just us, the trees, and the stars. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for. We hiked trails, fished in the nearby stream, and told stories around the campfire. The kids were thrilled to be away from their phones and video games, rediscovering the simple joys of nature. Lisa and I felt closer than we had in years, the stress of our busy lives melting away in the mountain air. On the third night, as we roasted marshmallows and played a game of cards by lantern light, I heard a twig snap in the woods behind our tent. At first I dismissed it as a deer or some other animal, but then came the sound of hushed voices and heavy footsteps. "Hello, campers," a man's voice called out, far too cheerful for the late hour. We all turned to see a group of men emerging from the tree line. There were 5 of them, dressed in a mishmash of outdoor gear and tattered clothes. The one in front, a tall man with a scraggly beard, was grinning widely, but there was something off about his smile, something that made my skin crawl. "Looks like you folks have a nice setup here," he said, his eyes roving over our campsite. "Mind if we join you for a bit?" I stood up, instinctively moving between the strangers and my family. "I'm sorry, but it's getting late," and we were just about to turn, and I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man's grin faltered for a moment, a flash of something dark crossing his face. "Now, that's not very neighborly," he said. "We've been walking for hours, and we could use a rest. Why don't you introduce us to your lovely family?" Lisa had gathered the kids close to her, her arm protectively around Emma's shoulders. I could see the fear in her eyes, mirroring my own growing unease. "Listen," I said, my tone firmer now, "I'm sure there are plenty of good camping spots nearby. We'd really prefer to have our privacy." One of the other men, a burly guy with a shaved head, stepped forward. "I don't think you understand," he growled. "We're not asking." My heart began to race as I realized the danger we were in. These weren't just some overly friendly campers. They had something else in mind, and it wasn't good. "Okay," I said, raising my hands in a pleading gesture. "Why don't you guys take what you want, and we'll be on our way. No trouble." The bearded man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the clearing. "Oh, we'll take what we want, all right. But you folks aren't going anywhere." In that moment, survival instinct kicked, and I knew we had to get out of there fast. I turned to Lisa and whispered urgently, "Get the kids to the car now." She nodded, her face pale but determined, as she began to usher Emma and Tyler towards our SUV. I tried to keep the men's attention on me. "Look, there's no need for this to get ugly," I said, slowly backing up towards the vehicle. "We don't want any trouble." But they were already advancing, spreading out to block our path. The bearded man pulled out a wicked-looking hunting knife, the blade glinting in the firelight. Too late for that, he snarled. What happened next was a blur of motion and terror. I grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it at the nearest man. He yelped in pain and surprise, stumbling backward using the momentary distraction. I turned and ran for the car. Lisa had the engine running, the kids already inside. I dove into the passenger seat just as she floored the accelerator. Gravel sprayed as we peeled out of the campsite, the angry shouts of the men fading behind us. But our relief was short-lived. As we careened down the narrow dirt road, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. They were coming after us. "They're following us," Emma cried from the back seat. Lisa gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles wide. "Hold on," she said through gritted teeth. The SUV back bounced and shuddered as we sped down the uneven road. Trees whipped past in a dark blur behind us. The headlights grew closer. They were gaining on us. Suddenly there was a loud bang, and the car lurched to the side. Lisa fought to keep control. As we skidded on the loose gravel, they're shooting at us. Tyler screamed, ducking down in his seat. Mine raced, trying to remember the route back to the main highway. It was at least 20 miles, maybe more. We'd never make it at this rate. There's a ranger station a few miles ahead, I said to Lisa. If we can make it there. She nodded, understanding it was our only hope. The next few minutes were the most terrifying of my life. Lisa drove like a woman possessed, taking curves at speeds that had us all holding on for dear life. All the while the headlights behind us grew closer, and the occasional crack of gunfire split the night. Just when I thought we couldn't possibly go any faster, the trees opened up to reveal a small clearing. The ranger station loomed ahead, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Lisa slammed on the brakes, the SUV fishtailing as we skid to a stop in front of the building. We all scrambled out, running for the door. I pounded on it with all my might. Help, please, somebody help us. The door flew open, revealing a startled-looking ranger. What in the world, please? I gasped. There are men chasing us. They have guns. The ranger's eyes widened, but to his credit, he reacted quickly. He ushered us inside, locking the door behind us. Get down, he ordered, moving to a radio on the desk. We huddled on the floor as the ranger called for backup outside. We could hear the screech of tires as our pursuers arrived. What followed was a tense standoff. The men tried to break in, but the sturdy door held. The ranger, armed with his service weapon, kept them at bay. All the while Lisa and I held our children close, whispering words of comfort. We didn't quite believe ourselves. It felt like hours, but it was probably only about 20 minutes before we heard the blessed sound of sirens. The cavalry had arrived. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights, police interviews, and shock blankets. The men were apprehended, and we learned they were wanted for a string of violent robberies across 3 states. They'd been hiding out in the national forest, preying on unsuspecting campers like us. As we sat in the back of an ambulance being checked over by paramedics, I looked at my family. Lisa's face was streaked with tears, and the kids looked shell-shocked. But we were alive. We had survived. In the days and weeks that followed, we struggled to process what had happened. The woods, once a place of peace and adventure for us, now held a darker meaning. Nightmares plagued us, all filled with shadowy figures and the sound of gunshots. But slowly we began to heal. We talked about our fears, supported each other through the tough moments, and eventually we made a decision that surprised even me. We decided to go camping again. It wasn't easy. The first time we set up a tent after the incident, every snapping twig made us jump, but we pushed through the fear, determined not to let those men rob us of something we loved. Now, as I sit by a campfire once more, watching Emma teach Tyler how to roast the perfect marshmallow, I feel a profound sense of gratitude. We came close to losing everything that night, but we didn't just survive. We reclaimed our love for the wilderness. The forest is still beautiful, still full of wonders, but now we appreciate it with open eyes, aware of both its magic and its dangers. We're more careful, more prepared, but we're also stronger, closer as a family than we've ever been. As the stars come out overhead and the fire crackles softly, I catch Lisa's eye across the flame. She smiles, and I see in her face the same mix of emotions. I feel lingering fear, yes, but also pride, love, and a deep, abiding peace. We made it through the darkness and found our way back to the light, and that I realize is the greatest adventure of all. The moment I heard them discussing their plan, I knew I had stumbled into something far more dangerous than just a group of rough campers. What I didn't realize was how quickly my peaceful hike would turn into a desperate fight for survival. I've always been an avid hiker, finding solace in the quiet of the woods and the challenge of conquering new trails. This particular weekend, I decided to explore a lesser-known path in the Ozarks. It was a bit more rugged than my usual routes, but the promise of pristine wilderness and spectacular views was too tempting to resist. The first day of my hike was everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound through dense forests and along ridge lines that offered breathtaking vistas of the surrounding mountains. The air was crisp and clear, clean, filled with the scent of pine and wild herbs. As the sun began to set, I found a small clearing to set up camp for the night. I was just finishing my dinner of rehydrated hiking food when I heard voices carrying on the evening breeze. At first, I was surprised. I hadn't seen another soul all day and thought I was miles from the nearest campsite. But then, I realized the voices didn't sound like typical campers. They were low, urgent, almost angry. Curiosity got the better of me. I doused my small fire and crept towards the sound, moving as quietly as I could through the underbrush. As I got closer, I could make out snippets of conversation. The drop is tomorrow night. We can't afford any screw-ups. What if the feds are onto us? This place was supposed to be secure. Relax, nobody knows about this spot. We'll be in and out before anyone's the wiser. My heart began to race as I realized what I was overhearing. This wasn't just some campfire chat. These people were planning something illegal, possibly dangerous. I inched closer, trying to get a better look through a gap in the trees. I could see a makeshift camp. There were 3 men, rough-looking characters, who seemed out of place in the wilderness. They were gathered around a map spread out on a crate pointing at various locations. Suddenly a twig snapped under my foot. The sound seemed deafening in the quiet forest. The men's heads snapped up, their conversation cutting off abruptly. I held my breath, pressing myself against a tree trunk, praying they hadn't spotted me. What was that? One of them growled, probably just an animal. Another replied, but he didn't sound convinced. I heard the sound of a gun being cocked. Check it out, the first man ordered. Panic surged through me. I had to get out of there fast, as quietly as I could. I began to back away from their camp, but in my haste, I wasn't watching where I was stepping. My foot caught on a route, and I stumbled, falling backwards. With a crash over there, one of the men shouted. I scrambled to my feet and ran, no longer caring about stealth. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush behind me, their shouts echoing through the trees. I ran blindly, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning with effort. I had no idea where was going, only that I needed to put as much distance between myself and those men as possible. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I paused, gasping for breath. The forest was quiet again. Had I lost them? Just as I was beginning to relax, I heard a twig snap nearby. I whirled around to see one of the men stepping out from behind a tree, a pistol leveled at my chest. Well, he said, a cruel smile twisting his features. Looks like we've got ourselves a little spy. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. I'm not a spy, I said, my voice shaking. I'm just a hiker. I got lost and heard voices. I thought you might be able to help me. He laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down my spine. Nice try, buddy, but you picked the wrong camp to stumble into. As he spoke, the other 2 men emerged from the trees, boxing me, and one of them was carrying a length of rope. What should we do with him? The rope carrier asked the man with the gun. Considered for a moment. We can't let him go. He's seen too much. My blood ran cold at his words. These men were willing to kill to keep their operation secret. In that moment of fear, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to die out here, not like this. Without thinking, I lunged at the gunman, catching him off guard. We went down in a tangle of limbs, wrestling for control of the weapon. I heard the other men shouting, felt hands grabbing at me, but I focused all my energy on keeping the gun pointed away from me. In the struggle, my fingers found the trigger. The gun went off with a deafening crack. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then the man beneath me went limp, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Taking advantage of the other's momentary shock, I scrambled to my feet and ran. I could hear them behind me, their shouts now tinged with rage and grief. I ran like I'd never run before pushing my body to its limits. The forest was a blur around me, every step a potential stumble, every shadow a potential hiding place for my pursuers. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning, but eventually I burst out of the tree line onto a gravel road. In the distance, I could see lights, a ranger station. With a final burst of energy, I sprinted towards it. Behind me, I heard the men emerge from the woods. One of them fired a shot, the bullet whizzing past my ear. I reached the station and pounded on the door, screaming for help. A startled ranger opened it, taking in my wild appearance with wide eyes. "Please," I gasped. "There are men. They're trying to kill me." The ranger pulled me inside and locked the door, immediately reaching for his radio to call for backup through the window. I saw my pursuers melt back into the forest, unwilling to risk a confrontation with law enforcement. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements and medical checks. I told them everything about overhearing the men's plans, about the chase through the woods, about the terrible moment when the gun went off. The authorities took my story seriously. They organized a search of the area. Though I knew the men would be long gone, they found the makeshift camp along with evidence of a large-scale drug operation. The man I had shot was discovered too, his body hastily buried in a shallow grave. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I'd gone into the woods seeking peace and adventure. Instead, I'd found violence and terror. I'd taken a life. Even if it was in self-defense, the wilderness, which had always been a place of solace for me, now held a darker meaning. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig brought back the fear of that night. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to come to terms with my experience. Nightmares plagued my sleep, and I found myself jumping at every unexpected sound. The thought of returning to the trail filled me with dread, but slowly, with the help of therapy and the support of my loved ones, I began to heal. I realized that what happened to me was a freak occurrence, not a reflection of the inherent danger of the wilderness. 6 months after that fateful hike, I found myself standing at the trailhead once again. My hands were shaking as I adjusted my backpack, but I was determined. I wouldn't let fear rob me of something I loved. As I took my first steps back into the forest, I felt a mix of anxiety and exhilaration. The woods were as beautiful as ever, the air fresh and invigorating. With each step, I felt a little stronger, a little braver. I know now that the wilderness, like life itself, contains both beauty and danger. What happened to me was terrible, but it also showed me how strong I could be when pushed to my limits. As I hiked deeper into the forest, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I was reclaiming this space, transforming it from a place of fear to one of healing and growth. The trail ahead was long and challenging, but I was ready to face it one step at a time. I was finding my way back to the person I used to be, older now, wiser, but still in love with the wild places of the world. The moment I tasted the strange chemical flavor in my water, I knew something was terribly wrong. What I didn't realize was how quickly my peaceful solo camping trip would spiral into a nightmarish fight for survival. I'd always been a loner, finding more comfort in the solitude of nature than in the chaos of city life. That's why I decided to take a week-long camping trip in the Adra, just me, my gear, and the great outdoors. I'd found a perfect spot miles from any marked trails or campsites where I could truly disconnect and recharge. The first few days were blissful. I spent my time hiking, taking photos of the stunning landscape, and enjoying the simple pleasure of being alone with my thoughts. Each night, I'd return to my campsite, cook a simple meal over my portable stove, and fall asleep to the gentle sounds of the forest. It was on the fourth day that things started to feel off. I'd gone for a long hike, pushing myself further than I had on previous days. When I returned to my camp exhausted and thirsty, I grabbed my water bottle and took a long drink. That's when I noticed it, a faint acrid taste that definitely shouldn't have been there. I spat the water out, my mind racing. Had my bottle somehow been contaminated? But as I examined it, I realized with growing horror that all of my water supplies tasted the same. Someone had tampered with them. While I was away, my heart began to pound as the implication sank, and I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been in my camp, had deliberately contaminated my water. But why? And were they still nearby? I scanned the trees surrounding my campsite, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The forest that had felt so welcoming now seemed to loom menacingly, every shadow potentially hiding a threat. I needed to leave now. But as I started to pack up my gear, a wave of dizziness washed over me. Whatever had been put in my water was starting to take effect. I stumbled, catching myself on a tree trunk. The world swam before my eyes, and I felt a cold old sweat break out on my forehead, fighting against the growing weakness in my limbs. I managed to stuff my essentials into my backpack. I had to get to safety, had to find help before the drug, because surely that's what it was, incapacitated me completely. As I shouldered my pack and took my first unsteady steps away from the campsite, I heard it, a twig snapping in the underbrush nearby. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Panic gave me a burst of energy, and I broke into a stumbling run. I had no idea which direction would lead me to safety, but I knew I couldn't stay there. Behind me I heard a shout, then the sound of pursuit. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. The effects of whatever I'd ingested were getting stronger, my vision blurred, and my movements felt sluggish and uncoordinated. But fear kept me going, pushing my body beyond its limits. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in a haze of terror and exhaustion. Eventually I broke through a line of trees and found myself at the edge of a steep ravine far below. I could hear the rush of a river. For a moment I stood swaying at the edge, unsure what to do. Then I heard voices behind me getting closer. I was trapped. In desperation, I began to climb down the ravine. It was steep and treacherous, loose rocks skittering away under my feet. Several times I nearly lost my footing, saved only by a desperate grab at a protruding root or rock. Halfway down, my luck ran out. My foot slipped on a patch of loose gravel, and suddenly I was falling, tumbling down the steep slope. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. For a moment I lay there, dazed and gasping for breath. As I struggled to my feet, I heard shouts from above. My pursuers had reached the edge of the ravine. I looked up to see two men peering down at me, their faces twisted with frustration and anger. "He's down there," one of them yelled. "Find a way down." Ignoring the pain radiating through my body, I staggered towards the river. It was my only chance now. I waded in the icy water, shocking me back to full alertness for a moment. Then I let the current take me, praying it would carry me to safety. The river was fast and rough, tossing me around like a rag doll. I struggled to keep my head above water, fighting against the drug-induced weakness and the pull of the current. Several times I went under, swallowing mouthfuls of water before managing to surface again. I have no idea how long I was in the river. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that eventually I found myself washed up on a rocky shore, coughing and shivering. The sky was growing dark, and I realized with a start that I'd lost an entire day. Hypothermia was setting in, my wet clothes clinging to my body and sapping what little warmth I had left. I needed to find shelter to get warm and dry, but I was lost with no idea where I was or which direction might lead me to safety. As I stumbled along the river bank, I spotted a dark opening in the rock face, nearby a cave. It wasn't ideal, but it would provide some shelter from the elements and a place to hide. I crawled into the cave, collapsing onto the cold stone floor. Every part of me ached, and the residual effects of the drug were making it hard to think clearly. but I knew I couldn't rest for long. My pursuers could still be out there searching for me. Using the last of my strength, I gathered some dry leaves and branches from just outside the cave and managed to start a small fire. The warmth was heavenly, and I stripped off my wet clothes, laying them out to dry. As I huddled by the fire trying to warm up, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Who were those men, and why were they after me? Had I somehow stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see? Or was I just a random target, unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? I must have dozed off at some point, because I woke with a start to the sound of voices echoing off the cave walls. For a terrifying moment I thought my pursuers had found me, but as I listened, I realized these voices were different. Concerned rather than threatening. Hello, a man's voice called out. Is someone in there? I hesitated, fear wearing with hope. Could this be a rescue or another trap? We're with search and rescue. Another voice added, we've been looking for a missing hiker. Are you okay? Relief washed over me, so intense it brought tears to my eyes. Here, I coped, my voice hoarse from disuse. I'm in here. The next few hours passed in a blur. The search and rescue team helped me out of the cave, wrapping me in warm blankets and giving me water, clean, safe water. They'd been alerted by a friend who'd grown concerned when I didn't check in as planned. As we made our way back to civilization, I told them my story. They listened with growing concern, radioing ahead to alert the authorities about the men who had chased me. In the days that followed, as I recovered in a hospital bed, the police investigated my claims. They found my original campsite and evidence that others had indeed been there. But of my pursuers, there was no sign. They had vanished back into the vast wilderness. It took me a long time to come to terms with what had happened. The forest, which had always been a place of peace and rejuvenation for me, now held a darker association. Nightmares plagued my sleep, filled with shadowy figures and endless chases through dark woods. But slowly, with time and therapy, I began to heal. I realized that what had happened to me was an anomaly, not the norm. The wilderness was still beautiful, still worthy of exploration and respect. A year after my ordeal, I found myself standing at a trailhead once again, backpack on my shoulders, a mixture of anxiety and excitement churning in my stomach. I wasn't alone this time. I joined a hiking group, not yet ready to venture out on my own again. As we set off down the trail, I felt a familiar sense of peace begin to settle over me. The forest was as beautiful as ever, the air fresh and invigorating. Yes, there had been danger here once, but there was also life and beauty and the promise of new adventures. I knew then that I would never again take my safety for granted in the wilderness, but neither would I let fear rob me of something I loved. The road to recovery was long, but with each step on the trail, I was reclaiming a part of myself I thought I'd lost forever. The forest had tested me, had shown me both its beauty and its danger, and I had survived, emerging stronger, wiser, and somehow even more in awe of the wild places of the world. The moment we stumbled upon the abandoned campsite with its torn tents and scattered belongings, I knew our fun weekend getaway had taken a dark turn. What I didn't realize was how quickly we'd find ourselves fighting for our lives in the very wilderness we'd come to enjoy. It was supposed to be a perfect trip, just me and my three best friends, Mike, Sarah, and Jess, escaping the city for a long weekend of hiking, campfires, and stargazing. We'd found this spot online, a secluded campground deep in the national forest, far from the usual tourist trails. The promise of true wilderness and solitude was too tempting to resist. The drive up was filled with laughter and excitement. We sang along to old songs, shared snacks, and talked about all the things we wanted to do. Once we reached our destination, as we turned onto the narrow dirt road that led to the campground, the dense forest closing in around us, I felt a sense of adventure I hadn't experienced in years. We arrived late afternoon, and quickly set about making camp Mike and I put up the tents while Sarah and Jess gathered firewood. By the time the sun was setting, we had a cozy little setup, 2 tents, a crackling fire, and the mouth-watering smell of hot dogs roasting on sticks. That first night was everything we'd hoped for. We sat around the fire sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The stars came out more brilliant than I'd ever seen them, unspoiled by city lights. As we turned in for the night, the only sounds were the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The next morning, we set out for a day hike, eager to explore the surrounding area. The trail wound through towering pines and across babbling streams. We took plenty of breaks, snapping photos and simply enjoying being out in nature. It was on our way back to camp that things started to feel off. The trail seemed different somehow, though none of us could quite put our finger on why. We chalked it up to our tired legs and the changing afternoon MO. Light, but an uneasy feeling had settled in the pit of my stomach. That's when we stumbled upon the other campsite. At first glance it looked like any other, a couple of tents, a fire pit, camping gear strewn about. But as we got closer, we realized something was very wrong. The tents were slashed open, their contents spilled across the ground. Sleeping bags lay in muddy heaps, and a cooler was overturned, its contents picked over by animals. But worst of all was the sense of violence that hung in the air. This wasn't just an abandoned camp, something bad had happened here. We should go, Sarah whispered, voicing what we were all thinking. But before we could move, we heard the distant rumble of engines. Getting closer, Hyde Mike hissed, pulling us towards a dense thicket of bushes. We crouched down, barely daring to breathe, as 3 ATVs roared into the clearing. 6 men dismounted, all carrying weapons, rifles, and large hunting knives. They looked rough, dangerous, nothing like the typical campers or hikers we expect to see out here. Anything. One of them called out, gesturing at the destroyed campsite. Another man shook his head. Looks like the animals got to it. No sign of the maps. Keep searching, the first man ordered. They couldn't have gotten far, not on foot. And we need those maps back. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. These men were clearly dangerous, and whatever they were involved in, we'd just become unwitting witnesses for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. We stayed frozen in our hiding spot as the men searched the area. Finally, mercifully, they returned to their ATVs and roared off down the trail. We waited until the sound of engines had completely faded before we dared to move. What the hell was that? Jess whispered, her voice shaking. I don't know, I replied, but we need to get out of here now. We set off at a quick pace, no longer caring about following the trail. Our only thought was putting as much distance between us and those men as possible. But as the sun began to set and the forest grew darker, a horrifying realization set in. We were lost in our panic. To get away, we veered off in a direction none of us recognized. The trees all looked the same in the fading light, and without the trail to guide us, we had no idea which way led back to our camp. We can't stay out here, Sarah said, voicing what we were all thinking. Those men are still out there, and who knows what else. Maybe we should just pick a direction and stick to it, Jess suggested. But before we could decide, BR, and we heard it again, the sound of engines growing closer. Run, Mike yelled, and we took off into the darkness. What followed was the most terrifying night of my life. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. The sound of ATVs seemed to come from every direction, the men's shouts echoing through the trees. At one point we came to a steep ravine with the sound of pursuit close behind us. We had no choice but to climb down. It was treacherous in the dark, and more than once I thought we'd fall to our deaths. But somehow we made it to the bottom. We splashed across a shallow stream, hoping the water might throw off any attempt to track us. On the other side, we found a small cave formed by a rocky overhang. It wasn't much, but it was the best shelter we'd seen, all night huddled in the damp darkness. While we tried to catch our breath and figure out what to do next, we were lost without food or proper gear, being hunted by armed men for reasons we didn't understand. It was like something out of a nightmare. "We need to keep moving," Mike whispered. "If we can make it until morning, maybe we can find our way back to the car." But as we prepared to leave our temporary shelter, a beam of light cut through the darkness, flashlights and voices getting closer. I saw something move over there. A gruff voice called out, "Check that outcropping." We pressed ourselves against the back of the cave, hardly daring to breathe. The beam of a flashlight swept across the entrance, so close I could have reached out and touched it. For a heart-stopping moment, I was sure we'd be discovered, but then the light moved on, and the voices faded into the distance. We waited silent and terrified for what felt like hours. Finally, when we were as sure as we could be that the coast was clear, we crept out of the cave. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. We kept moving, driven by the need to put distance between us and our pursuers. Every snapping twig made us jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we heard something that made our hearts soar, the distant sound of traffic. Somehow, in our panicked flight, we'd made it close to a road. With renewed energy, we pushed on. Finally, we broke through the tree line and saw it, a highway stretching out before us. We flagged down the first car. We saw a startled-looking couple who took in our bedraggled appearance with wide eyes. They drove us to the nearest police station, where we spent the next several hours giving statements and trying to explain our terrifying night in the woods. The authorities took our story seriously, organizing a search of the area. In the days that followed, as we tried to process what had happened, we learned bits and pieces from the news. The men we'd encountered were part of a drug smuggling operation that used the remote wilderness as a distribution point. The maps they were looking for were actually coded ledgers detailing drop points and contacts. It took a long time for any of us to feel normal again. Nightmares plagued our sleep, filled with dark forests and the roar of engines. The wilderness, which had once been a place of peace and adventure, now held a shadow of fear. But slowly we began to heal. We talked about our experience, supported each other through the tough moments, and eventually we made a decision that surprised even me. We decided to go camping again. It wasn't easy the first time we set up a tent after the incident. Every snapping twig made us jump, but we pushed through the fear, determined not to let one terrible experience rob us of something we love. Now, as I sit by a campfire once more, watching the stars come out overhead, I feel a profound sense of gratitude. We survived something truly terrifying and came out stronger for it. The forest is still beautiful, still full of wonders, but now we appreciate it with open eyes, aware of both its magic and its dangers. Our experience taught us that even in the darkest moments, human resilience and the bonds of friendship can see us through, and that perhaps is the greatest lesson the wilderness has to offer. The moment I woke to find a stranger looming over me in the darkness, I knew my peaceful solo camping trip had turned into a nightmare. What I didn't realize was how quickly I'd be fighting for my life in the very wilderness of I come to enjoy. I'd always been a bit of a loner, finding more solace in the quiet of nature than in the chaos of city life. That's why I decided to take a week-long camping trip in the Adra, just me, my gear, and the great outdoors. I'd found a perfect spot miles from any marked trails or campsites where I could truly disconnect and recharge. The first few days were blissful. I spent my time hiking, taking photos of the stunning landscape, and enjoying the simple pleasure of being alone with my thoughts. Each night, I'd return to my campsite, cook a simple meal over my portable stove, and fall asleep to the gentle sounds of the forest. It was on the fourth night that things started to feel off. I'd gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day of hiking, but something woke me in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it might have been an animal rustling around out inside my tent, but as I lay there straining my ears, I realized the sounds were too deliberate, too careful to be wildlife. My heart began to race. As I heard the slow, methodical sound of my tent zipper being opened, I held my breath, hoping against hope that this was just a vivid nightmare. But the cool night air that rushed in told me this was all too real. A shadowy figure loomed over me, backlit by the faint moonlight filtering through the tent opening. I could make out the outline of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, but his face was hidden in shadow. For a moment, we both froze there. Silence broken only by my thundering heartbeat. Then, acting on pure instinct, I lashed out with my sleeping bag tangling the intruder's legs. As he stumbled, I scrambled for the small knife I kept nearby for cutting rope, and kindling, the man cursed and lunged for me, his hands grasping in the darkness. I rolled away, my fingers finally closing around the handle of my knife. Without thinking, I slashed out, feeling the blade connect with something solid. The intruder howled in pain and reeled back, giving me the opening I needed. I burst out of the tent, not even bothering with shoes or a jacket. The forest floor was cold and damp under my bare feet, but I barely noticed as I ran, driven by pure adrenaline. Behind me, I could hear the man crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. His angry shouts echoed through the trees, spurring me to run faster. I had no idea where I was going in the darkness, only that I needed to get away. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I ran, leaving stinging scratches. Roots and rocks threatened to trip me at every step. But still I pushed on. The sound of pursuit never far behind. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I burst through a line of trees into a small clearing. In the center was a large moss-covered boulder. Without thinking, I made for it, scrambling up its slippery surface and wedging myself into a small crevice on the far side. I huddled there, trying to quiet my ragged breathing, as I heard my pursuer enter the clearing. His footsteps circled the boulder, pausing occasionally as he searched for signs of my passage. Come out, wherever you are," he called, his voice a chilling mix of anger and amusement. "You can't hide forever, little camper." I pressed myself further into the crevice, willing myself to become invisible. My hand still clutching the knife was slick with what I realized must be blood, his or mine. I couldn't tell in the darkness. For what felt like an eternity, the man prowled around the clearing. I could hear him muttering to himself, his frustration growing with each passing minute. Finally, after one last circuit of the boulder, he let out an angry growl. "Fine," he spat, "have it your way, but don't think this is over. These are my woods, and I'll find you eventually." His footsteps receded, and soon the clearing was silent once more. Still, I didn't dare move. I stayed in my hiding spot, shivering in the cool night air until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Only then did I slowly, painfully extract myself from the crevice. My muscles screamed in protest, stiff from hours of being cramped in one position. In the growing light, I could see the extent of my injuries. Scratches and bruises covered my arms and legs, and my feet were cut and bleeding from my barefoot flight through the forest. I knew I couldn't stay here. The man might return, and I was in no condition to outrun him again. But I was hopelessly lost, with no idea which direction might lead me back to civilization. Picking a direction at random, I started walking. Each step was agony on my battered feet, but fear kept me moving. As the sun rose higher, the forest came alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. Under different circumstances, I might have found it beautiful. Now every noise made me flinch, certain that my pursuer was about to leap out from behind a tree. As the day wore on, exhaustion and hunger began to take their toll. My pace slowed to a stumbling walk, and more than once I found myself on the verge of giving up, but The memory of that terrifying night kept me going one painful step at a time. It was late afternoon when I heard it, the faint sound of running water. Hope surged through me, giving me a second wind. Where there was water, there might be people, or at least a way to orient myself. I pushed through a dense patch of undergrowth and found myself on the bank of a fast-moving stream. The sight of clean fresh water was almost enough to make me weep with relief. I fell to my knees at the water's edge, drinking deeply and splashing the cool liquid on my face and wounds. As I sat there trying to decide what to do next, I noticed something that made my heart leap. Fresh boot prints in the mud near the water's edge. And they weren't mine. For a moment, panic gripped me. Had my pursuer found me again? But as I examined the prints more closely, I realized they were different from the ones I'd seen around my campsite. These were deeper, with a distinctive tread pattern. They looked like they might belong to a ranger or a serious hiker. Hope went with caution as I debated what to do. Following the prints might lead me to safety, or it might lead me straight into another dangerous situation. But staying here lost and alone in the woods wasn't an option either. Taking a deep breath, I made my decision. I would follow the prints, but cautiously, ready to hide at the first sign of danger. For hours, I traced the boot prints along the stream bank as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. I started to worry that I'd made the wrong choice, but just as I was about to give up hope, I saw it, a thin trail of smoke rising above the trees in the distance. Gathering the last of my strength, I pushed on toward the smoke. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a small cabin nestled in a clearing. Light spilled from its windows, and I could see a figure moving around inside. Part of me wanted to run straight to the cabin and throw myself at the mercy of whoever was inside, but caution held me back. I crept close, trying to get a better look without being seen. That's when I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a radio crackling to life, followed by a man's voice. Ranger station for checking in. All quiet on the eastern trail. Relief washed over me in a wave so strong it nearly brought me to my knees. I stumbled out of the tree line, waving my arms and calling out. The ranger burst out of the cabin, his hand on his sidearm, until he saw the state I was in. His eyes widened as he took in my battered appearance. "Good Lord," he said, rushing to my side. "What happened to you?" The whole story came pouring out of me, then my words tumbling over each other in my haste to explain. The ranger listened with growing concern, immediately radioing for backup and medical assistance. In the days that followed, as I recovered in a hospital bed, the authorities mounted a search for my attacker. They found my campsite ransacked and abandoned, but of the man himself there was no sign. He had vanished back into the vast wilderness. It took me a long time to come to terms with what had happened. The forest, which had always been a place of peace and rejuvenation for me, now held a darker association. Nightmares plagued my sleep, filled with shadowy figures and endless chases through dark woods. But slowly, with time and therapy, I began to heal. I realized that what had happened to me was an anomaly, not the norm. The wilderness was still beautiful, still worthy of exploration and respect. A year after my ordeal, I found myself standing at a trailhead once again, backpack on my shoulders, a mixture of anxiety and excitement churning in my stomach. I wasn't alone this time. I joined a hiking group, not yet ready to venture out on my own again. As we set off down the trail, I felt a familiar sense of peace begin to settle over me. The forest was as beautiful as ever. The air fresh and invigorating. Yes, there had been danger here once, but there was also life and beauty, and the promise of new adventures. I knew then that I would never again take my safety for granted in the wilderness, but neither would I let fear rob me of something I loved. The road to recovery was long, but with each step on the trail I was reclaiming a part of myself I thought I'd lost forever. The forest had tested me, had shown me both its beauty and its danger. and I had survived, emerging stronger, wiser, and somehow even more in awe of the wild places of the world. The moment we stumbled upon the cave filled with stolen goods, I knew our casual hiking trip had taken a dangerous turn. What I didn't realize was how quickly we'd be running for our lives through the very wilderness we'd come to enjoy. It was supposed to be a simple day hike, just me and my best friend Alex taking advantage of the perfect spring weather to explore a new trail we'd heard about. We'd been cooped up all winter, and the promise of fresh air and beautiful views was too tempting to resist. The morning started off perfectly. We arrived at the trailhead early, the air crisp and filled with the scent of pine. Alex was in high spirits, cracking jokes as we shouldered our day packs and set off down the trail. The path wound through dense forest, occasionally opening up to reveal stunning vistas of the surrounding mountains. We'd been hiking for about 3 hours when we decided to take a break for lunch. As we sat on a fallen log munching on our sandwiches, Alex spotted something interesting. "Hey, check that out," he said, pointing to a narrow opening in the rock face nearby. "Looks like it might be a cave." I squinted at the dark gap. "Could be want to check it out?" Alex grinned. "Always up for a bit of adventure. Why not? Might be cool inside." We packed up our lunch things and made our way over to the cave entrance. It was larger than it had appeared from a distance, easily big enough for us to walk through without stooping. Alex pulled out his headlamp, and I switched on my flashlight. As we ventured inside, at first it seemed like a typical small cave, cool, damp, with the occasional drip of water echoing off the walls. But as we moved deeper, the space opened up into a larger cavern, and that's when we saw it. Stacked against one wall were crates and boxes, some sealed, others partially open. Scattered around were various items, electronics, jewelry, even what looked like antiques. It didn't take a genius to realize we'd stumbled upon some kind of stash, a big one. "Holy!" Alex whispered, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. Are these all stolen?" I nodded slowly, a knot of fear forming in my stomach. "Has to be. This is way too much stuff to just be abandoned here." We stood there for a moment, the gravity of our discovery sinking in. Then Alex started moving towards one of the open crates. "What are you doing?" I hissed, grabbing his arm. He shook me off. "Just want to see what's in here. Maybe we can figure out where this stuff came from." I knew it was a bad idea, but curiosity got the better of me too. We began carefully examining the contents of the crates, finding everything from high-end laptops to rare coins. It was like we'd stumbled into some kind of criminal warehouse. We were so engrossed in our exploration that we almost missed the sound of voices echoing from the cave entrance. Almost. Alex and I froze, looking at each other in panic. The voices were getting closer, and they didn't sound friendly. "I'm telling you, I heard something down here," a gruff voice said. "Probably just some animal, but we better check it out." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. There was only one way in or out of this cavern, and the owners of those voices were blocking it. We were trapped. Alex pointed to a pile of empty crates in one corner. Without a word, we hurried over and squeezed behind them, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. I switched off my flashlight, and Alex did the same with his headlamp, plunging us into darkness. Just in time, 2 men entered the cavern, their powerful flashlights sweeping across the space from our hiding spot. I could see them clearly, though I wished I couldn't. They were rough-looking characters, the kind you crossed the street to avoid if you saw them coming, and they were armed. "See," one of them said, "nothing here but our stuff." The other man grunted, moving further into the cavern. "Maybe, but something don't feel right. Let's do a thorough check just to be sure." I held my breath as they began methodically searching the sea cavern. They were thorough, checking behind stacks of crates and peering into dark corners. It was only a matter of time before they found us. Beside me, I could feel Alex tensing up. I knew what he was thinking. If we were going to make a run for it, now might be our only chance. I gave his arm a squeeze, hoping he'd understand my silent message. "Wait, not yet." The Men were getting closer to our hiding spot. I could hear the scuff of their boots on the cave floor, see the beams of their flashlights getting brighter. My heart was racing, and I had to fight the urge to close my eyes, as if that would somehow make us invisible. Just when I thought we were done, for a loud noise echoed through the cave, the sound of something heavy falling over near the entrance. Both men whirled around, their lights focusing on the source of the noise. What the hell was that? One of them growled. Don't know, could be the others coming back early, or could be trouble. Let's check it out. They moved towards the cave entrance, their attention momentarily diverted. It was now or never. I tugged on Alex's arm, and we burst from our hiding place. The sudden movement caught the men off guard, and for a crucial second, they just stood there stunned. We ran for the entrance, pushing past them. Before they could react, I heard a shout behind us, then the terrifying sound of a gun being cocked. We didn't stop to look back, just ran full tilt into the forest. The calm trail we'd enjoyed earlier now seemed like a gauntlet of obstacles. Roots threatened to trip us. Hanging branches whipped at our faces, but fear lent us speed, and we crashed through the underbrush, putting distance between us and our pursuers. I could hear them behind us, their angry shouts echoing through the trees. They knew these woods better than we did, and they were gaining on us. We need to split up, Alex gasped as we ran, make it harder for them to follow. I wanted to argue, to say we stood a better chance together, but deep down I knew he was right. With a quick nod, I veered left while he went right. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning and my legs aching. Every snapping twig made me flinch, every shadow seemed to hide a threat. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to get as far away from the cave as possible. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I found myself at the edge of a steep ravine. The sound of rushing water came from far below. I was trapped. The voices were getting closer. I looked around, frantically searching for a way out. That's when I spotted it, a narrow ledge leading down the side of the ravine. It looked treacherous, barely wide enough to put one foot in front of the other, but it was my only option. Taking a deep breath, I began to edge my way down. The rock face was slick with moss, and more than once I nearly lost my footing, but desperation kept me going. Inch by perilous inch, I was about halfway down when I heard them reach the top of the ravine. I pressed myself against the rock face, hardly daring to breathe. Where'd he go? One of them shouted, his voice echoing off the ravine walls. Must have found a way down. No way. He jumped. I stayed perfectly still, praying they wouldn't spot me on my precarious perch for agonizing minutes. I listened to them searching the area above, then mercifully their voices began to fade as they moved off, presumably to search elsewhere. It took me another nerve-wracking hour to make it to the bottom of the ravine, but by then my arms and legs were shaking from exertion and leftover adrenaline. But I couldn't rest yet. I needed to find help, and I needed to find Alex. I followed the river at the bottom of the ravine, hoping it would lead me to civilization. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, I finally heard something that made my heart soar, the distant sound of traffic. Summoning the last of my strength, I clambered up the riverbank and through a final stretch of woods, and there it was, a highway stretching out before me. I've never been so happy to see asphalt in my life. I flagged down the first car I saw, probably looking like a madman with my torn clothes and wild eyes. The startled driver, a kind FAC woman in her 50s, listened to my breathless explanation and immediately called the police. What followed was a whirlwind of police statements, search parties, and anxious waiting. It wasn't until the next morning that we got the news they'd found Alex. He was dehydrated and scratched up, but alive. He'd managed to find a ranger station and raise the alarm. The authorities took our discovery of the cave very seriously. They organized a raid, catching several members of what turned out to be a major theft ring. The cave was just one of several stashes they'd hidden throughout the state park in the days and weeks that followed as Alex and I tried to process what had happened. We found ourselves dealing with a mix of emotions, relief at having survived certainly, but also a lingering fear, a new awareness of the dangers that can lurk in even the most beautiful places. It took time, but eventually we both found our way back to the trails. Our first hike after the incident was tense, every snapping twig making us jump, but as we walked feeling the sun on our faces and the earth beneath our feet, we remembered why we loved this so much in the first place. The wilderness had shown us its darker side, yes, but it had also shown us our own strength, our resilience. We'd faced real danger and come out the other side, and in doing so we gained a deeper appreciation for the wild places of the world, their beauty, their challenges, and the profound effect they can have on the human spirit. Now, when I stand at a trailhead, I feel a mix of excitement and respect. The forest is not just a playground, but a place of mystery and potential danger. And yet, I'm drawn to it more than ever because I know that out there among the trees and mountains I'll find not just adventure, but a truer version of myself. The moment the old couple's eyes glinted with malice over the dinner table, I knew my quaint research trip had turned into a nightmare. What I didn't realize was how quickly I'd be fighting for my escape from the very people who'd welcomed me into their home. I'd come to this small town in Virginia for my anthropology thesis, studying the evolution of rural communities in the digital age. It was supposed to be a straightforward field study, interviews, observations, and immersing myself in local culture. The town seemed perfect, picturesque, isolated, and seemingly untouched by time. My first week had gone smoothly. The locals were friendly, if a bit reserved, and I'd gathered some fascinating data. But it was Mr. and Mrs. Harding who really caught my attention. They were the town's oldest residents, a couple in their late 80s who'd lived here their entire lives. When they invited me to dinner, I jumped at the chance. It was an anthropologist's dream, a direct link to the town's past. Their house was exactly what you'd expect from an elderly couple in a small town. Doilies on every surface, faded family photos lining the walls, and the faint smell of mothballs in the air. Mrs. Harding fussed over me as soon as I arrived, insisting I take off my coat and make myself comfortable. It's not often we get visitors, she said, her wrinkled face creasing into a smile. Especially not young folks like yourself. Mr. Harding nodded from his armchair, pipe clenched between his teeth. Towns not what it used to be, he grumbled. Young people all moving away, no respect for tradition. I sat down, notebook in hand, eager to hear more. This was exactly the kind of perspective I was looking for. As Mrs. Harding busied herself in the kitchen, I asked Mr. Harding about the town's history. He was happy to oblige, spinning tales of the town's founding, the hardships they faced, and how things had changed over the years. I was so engrossed in his stories that I barely noticed the time passing. It wasn't until Mrs. Harding called us to dinner that I realized how late it had gotten. The sun had set, and a thick fog had rolled in, obscuring the view from the windows. You'll stay for dinner, of course, Mrs. Harding said. It wasn't a question. I hesitated, not wanting to impose, but they insisted, and truth be told, the smell wafting from the kitchen was mouth-watering, so I agreed, settling into a chair at their dining room table. The food was delicious, a hearty pot roast with vegetables from their garden. As we ate, the conversation flowed easily. The Hardings were full of questions about my research, my background, my family. In retrospect, I should have noticed how personal their inquiries were getting, how intently they watched my reactions. But I was too caught up in the moment, too excited about the wealth of information I was gathering. It wasn't until dessert that things started to feel off. Mrs. Harding brought out a homemade pie, setting it on the table with a flourish. It's a special recipe, she said, her eyes twinkling. Been in the family for generations. I took a bite, and immediately noticed something strange about the taste. It was sweet, but with an underlying bitterness that made my tongue tingle. "What kind of pie is this?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Mr. Harding chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "Oh, it's our own special blend, helps people relax." That's when I noticed the room starting to spin. My limbs felt heavy, and my thoughts were becoming foggy with growing horror. I realized I'd been drugged. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I stumbled, catching myself on the edge of the table. The Hardings made no move to help me. Instead, they watched with an eerie calmness, their earlier warmth replaced by cold calculation. What did you do to me?" I slurred, fighting to stay conscious. Mrs. Harding's smile turned cruel. "Now, dear, don't fuss. It'll all be over soon. You'll be joining our family, just like the others." My blood ran cold at her words. Others? How many people had fallen into this trap before me? With the last of my strength, I lunged for the door. But Mr. Harding was faster than he looked. He caught me easily, his grip surprisingly strong for a man his age. "You're not going anywhere," he growled. "This town needs new blood, and you're it." I struggled weakly against his hold, but the drug was taking full effect. The room swam before my eyes, and darkness crept in at the edges of my vision. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was Mrs. Harding's face, her kindly grandmother facade replaced by something ancient and hungry. I woke to darkness and the smell of damp earth. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then it all came rushing back: the dinner, the drug pie, the Harding's sinister plan. I tried to move, only to find my wrists and ankles bound tightly. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized I was in some kind of cellar. The walls were rough stone, and the only light came from a small barred window near the ceiling. I could hear movement above me, footsteps and muffled voices. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to think I needed to find a way out of this. I twisted my wrists, testing the bonds, but they were frustratingly secure. Whoever had tied them knew what they were doing. Hours passed, marked only by the shifting of light through the tiny window. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the remnants of the drug still coursing through my system. Each time I woke, I hoped it had all been a terrible dream, but the ropes digging into my skin and the cold stone floor beneath me were all too real. Finally, I heard the creak of a door opening. Light spilled down a set of stairs, and two figures descended. Mr. and Mrs. Harding, looking for all the world like a sweet elderly couple, save for the malevolent gleam in their eyes. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Harding chirped, as if this were a normal social call. "I do hope you slept well." I glared at them, finding my voice at last. "What do you want from me?" Mr. Harding chuckled, that same unsettling sound from the night before. "It's not about what we want, it's about what the town needs. New blood, new life. And you, my dear, are going to provide it." As they spoke, the horrible truth began to dawn on me. This wasn't just about two deranged individuals. The whole town was in on it. The friendly locals, the quaint facade. It was all a trap designed to lure in unsuspecting outsiders like myself. "Why, you can't keep me here," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "People will come looking for me." Mrs. Harding's smile widened. "Oh, I don't think so. You told us yourself, dear. No family, no close friends, just you and your research. Nobody will miss you for quite some time, and by then, well." She trailed off, leaving the implications hanging in the air. They left shortly after, promising to return with food later. As the cellar door clicked shut behind them, I felt despair washing over me. They were right. I had been so focused on my research, so eager to immerse myself in this community, that I de-isolated myself from everyone else. It could be weeks before anyone realized I was missing, but I couldn't give up. I had to find a way out. I spent hours working at my bonds, ignoring the pain as the ropes chafed my skin raw. I examined every inch of the cellar, looking for weaknesses, for anything I could use to my advantage. Days passed in a blur of fear and desperate planning. The Hardings came regularly, bringing food and water, always watching me with those unsettling eyes. They spoke of preparations being made, of a ceremony to come. I tried to get more information out of them to understand what they were planning, but they remained frustratingly vague. It was on the 5th day of my captivity that I finally caught a break. Mrs. Harding came alone, carrying a tray of food. As she set it down, I noticed her hand shaking slightly. Age, I realized, was catching up with her. Despite whatever sinister forces were at work in this town, I saw my chance and took it. As she leaned in to adjust my bonds, I surged upward, headbutting her with all my strength. She went down with a cry, the keys to my chains clattering to the floor. Ignoring the pain exploding through my skull, I maneuvered myself over to the keys. It was awkward and slow with my hands still bound, but desperation lent me strength and flexibility I didn't know I possessed. I had just managed to free myself when I heard footsteps pounding down the stairs. Mr. Harding burst into the cellar, his face contorted with rage. But I was ready. I ducked under his grasping hands and bolted for the stairs. The next few minutes were a blur of adrenaline and terror. I raced through the house, hearing Mr. Harding's labored breathing behind me. I burst out the front door and into the street, only to find myself faced with a group of townspeople, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. For a moment, I froze, certain that this was the end. But then survival instinct kicked and I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. I could hear shouts behind me, the sound of pursuit growing as more people joined the chase. I ran without direction, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and my captors as possible. The town blurred around me, quaint storefronts and picket fences giving way to fields and then dense forest. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but every time I thought about stopping, I remembered the cellar, the Harding's cruel smiles, and I found a new reserve of energy. Finally, mercifully, I broke through the tree line and found myself on a highway. I flagged down the first car I saw, probably looking like a mad woman with my wild eyes and torn clothes. The startled driver, a middle-aged man in a business suit, listened to my breathless explanation and immediately called the police. What followed was a whirlwind of police statements, hospital visits, and traumatized phone calls to my family and thesis advisor. The authorities took my story seriously, organizing a raid on the town. But by the time they arrived, the place was deserted. The Hardings, the other residents, everyone gone without a trace. In the months that followed, as I tried to piece my life back together, I couldn't shake the memory of those 5 days. The terror, yes, but also the realization of how easily I'd walked into their trap. I'd been so eager for the perfect research subject that I'd ignored all the warning signs. My thesis remained unfinished. How could I continue to study rural communities when every small town now held the shadow of potential danger? But slowly, I began to find a new direction. I started looking into cults, into the psychology of isolated communities. I wanted to understand what could drive an entire town to such extremes. Now, years later, I still catch myself looking over my shoulder in unfamiliar places. The experience changed me, made me more cautious, more aware of the darkness that can hide behind the most benign facades. But it also showed me my own strength, my will to survive. I never returned to that town. As far as I know, it remains abandoned, a ghost town with a terrible secret. But sometimes on dark nights, when the wind howls just right, I can almost hear Mrs. Harding's voice, sweet and terrible. "You'll be joining our family just like the others." And I shuddered, grateful for my narrow escape and for the wisdom it brought at such a heavy price. The moment I saw the armed men through my camera lens, I knew my peaceful nature photography trip had turned into a dangerous game of cat and mouse. What I didn't realize was how quickly I'd be running for my life through the very wilderness I'd come to capture. I'd always been passionate about wildlife photography. There's something magical about freezing a moment in time, capturing the raw beauty of nature in a single frame. That's what brought me to this remote corner of the Pacific Northwest, miles from the nearest town and even further from anything resembling civilization. I'd been out here for nearly a week, my tent a temporary home amidst the towering pines and rugged landscape. The solitude was blissful, broken only by the calls of birds and the occasional rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. Each day I'd wake with the sun, eager to see what new wonders I might capture through my lens. On this particular morning, I set out just as the first rays of sunlight were painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. I had a specific location in mind, a small clearing where I'd spotted a family of deer the day before. I was hoping to catch them in the soft morning light, maybe even capture a fawn taking its first tentative steps. The hike was invigorating, the crisp morning air filling my lungs as I carefully picked my way along the faint trail. The weight of my camera gear was familiar and comforting on my back. As I neared the clearing, I slowed my pace, moving as quietly as possible to avoid startling any wildlife. I reached the edge of the clearing and crouched down, surveying the area before entering. That's when I saw them, 3 men dressed in camouflage, carrying high-powered rifles. They were gathered around something on the ground, something large. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. It wasn't a deer they were standing over, but a bear, a massive grizzly. Its magnificent coat now stained red. These weren't hunters, this was poaching, plain and simple. Without thinking, I raised my camera and started shooting. The telephoto lens brought the scene into sharp focus, the men's faces, the guns, the dead bear evidence. My heart was pounding, but my hands remained steady, years of practice taking over. I was so focused on capturing the scene that I didn't notice one of the men look up, didn't see him nudge his companions and point in my direction. It wasn't until I heard the shout that I realized my mistake. "Hey, you there?" I dropped to the ground, but it was too late. They'd seen me. Panic surged through me as I heard them start to move in my direction. I scrambled backward, staying low, then turned and ran. The forest that had seemed so peaceful just moments ago now felt oppressive, full of obstacles trying to trip me up. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, the sound of pursuit behind me spurring me on. I ran blindly, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and the poachers as possible. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but fear kept me moving. I could hear them shouting to each other, their voices too close for comfort. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the trees onto a rocky slope. I paused for a moment, gasping for breath, trying to get my bearings. That's when I heard the gunshot, the crack of it. Rifle echoed through the valley, followed by the whine of a bullet passing far too close. They were shooting at me. This wasn't about scaring me off anymore. They meant to silence me permanently. I dove behind a large boulder, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. What had I gotten myself into? I was no action hero, just a wildlife photographer who'd stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. Another shot rang out, chips of rock exploding from the boulder next to my head. I needed to move to find better cover. My eyes darted around, looking for an escape route. The slope continued upward, becoming steeper and rockier. It would be difficult terrain, but it might slow my pursuers down. Taking a deep breath, I sprinted from behind the boulder, zigzagging as I climbed. More shots followed, but the uneven ground seemed to throw off their aim. I didn't look back, focusing all my energy on the climb. I reached a small ledge and allowed myself a moment's rest, pressing myself against the rock face. The shouts of the men were more distant now, but still too close for comfort. I knew I couldn't keep this pace up for long. I needed a plan. That's when I remembered my satellite phone safely tucked away in my backpack. If I could just find a moment to make a call to alert the authorities. But first, I needed to find a safe spot. I continued my climb, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The terrain became increasingly difficult, requiring all my concentration to navigate safely. The voices of my pursuers faded, replaced by the sound of my own labored breathing and pounding heart. Finally, I reached a small cave-like opening in the rock face. It wasn't deep, but it offered some shelter and a place to catch my breath. I squeezed inside, wincing as my camera bag scraped against the rock. I'd forgotten I was still carrying it. The instinct to protect my gear, ingrained after years of field worker. With shaking hands, I unzipped my backpack and pulled out the satellite phone. As I went to turn it on, my heart sank. The screen remained dark, dead battery. I'd been so caught up in my photography over the past few days that I'd forgotten to charge it. A wave of despair washed over me. I was alone, being hunted by armed men with no way to call for help. For a moment, I considered giving up. Maybe if I surrendered, explained that I'd delete the photos. No, I couldn't take that risk. These men had already shown they were willing to kill. I had to keep going, had to find a way out of this. I allowed myself a few more minutes of rest, then reluctantly left the safety of my rocky shelter. The sun was high in the sky now, the heat making my clothes stick to my skin with sweat. I needed to find water soon, or dehydration would become as much of a threat as the poachers. I continued moving, sticking to areas with more cover. Every snapping twig made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Hours passed this way, the strain of constant vigilance taking its toll. As the light began to fade, I knew I needed to find a place to spend the night. The thought of being out here in the dark, knowing those men were still looking for me, made my skin crawl. But I had no choice. I found a dense thicket of bushes and crawled inside, ignoring the scratches from the branches. It wasn't comfortable, but it offered some concealment. I curled up, trying to make myself as small as possible. Sleep was impossible. Every sound had me tensing, expecting to see the barrel of a gun poking through the leaves. I clutched my camera bag to my chest. The evidence it contained feeling more like a curse than an asset. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the leaves, I heard a new sound, a rhythmic thudding that grew louder by the second. I held my breath, not daring to move. The sound grew to a roar, and suddenly a large shape passed overhead, a helicopter. My heart leapt. Someone was looking for me. I burst out of my hiding place, waving my arms frantically. The helicopter circled back, hovering lower. I could see the words "Forest Service" emblazoned on its side. As it landed in a nearby clearing, I felt a wave of relief, so strong it nearly brought me to my knees. Park rangers poured out, rushing to my side. Their questions washed over me. In a blur, was I hurt? Were the men still in the area? Did I need medical attention? I managed to stammer out my story, showing them the photos on my camera. Their faces grew grave as they realized the extent of what I had uncovered. One of the rangers, an older man with kind eyes, placed a hand on my shoulder. "You've been incredibly brave," he said, "but you're safe now. We'll take care of everything from here." As they led me to the helicopter, I took one last look at the wilderness around me. It was as beautiful as ever, the morning sun painting the landscape in soft light. But now I knew the darkness that could lurk in even the most beautiful places. I was alive, I had survived, and I had the evidence to bring those poachers to justice. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying me back to safety, I made a silent promise to myself I would return to the wild. I wouldn't let this experience rob me of my passion. But next time I'd be better prepared, more cautious, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit braver. The moment I found the first threatening note pinned to our cabin door, I knew our romantic getaway had taken a sinister turn. What I didn't realize was how quickly it would escalate into a terrifying fight for survival in the very wilderness we'd come to enjoy. My girlfriend Sarah and I had been planning this trip for months. We both had high-stress jobs in the city, and desperately needed some time away from the constant noise and pressure. When we found this secluded cabin online nestled deep in the mountains, with no neighbors for miles, it seemed perfect, a week of peace, quiet, and each other's company. Just what we needed to reconnect and recharge. The drive up was beautiful, the road winding through dense forests and alongside crystal clear streams. As we pulled up to the cabin, I felt the tension of the past few months start to melt away. The cabin was everything we'd hoped for, rustic but comfortable, with a wide porch overlooking a stunning valley. The first evening was idyllic. We unpacked, cooked dinner together, and sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink as darkness fell. We marveled at the stars, so much brighter here than in the city. We went to bed that night feeling relaxed and optimistic about the week ahead. The next morning, I woke early, eager to explore our surroundings. I slipped out of bed, trying not to wake Sarah, and headed to the porch to enjoy my morning coffee. That's when I saw it, a piece of paper pinned to the cabin door, fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. Curious, I walked over and unpinned it. As I read the words scrolled on the paper, I felt a chill run down my spine. "You don't belong here, leave now or else." I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I was reading. Was this some kind of joke, a prank by the cabin owners to scare city folks? But something about the crude handwriting, the force with which the note had been pinned to the door, felt too real, too threatening. I debated whether to tell Sarah. I didn't want to ruin our vacation over what might be nothing. In the end, I decided to keep it to myself for now. I crumpled up the note and shoved it in my pocket, determined not to let it spoil our day. We spent the morning hiking, enjoying the crisp mountain air and the beautiful scenery. Sarah was in high spirits, pointing out interesting plants and birds, her laugh echoing through the trees. I tried to match her enthusiasm, but the note kept nagging at the back of my mind. When we returned to the cabin that afternoon, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The door was slightly ajar, though I was certain we'd locked it before leaving. Sarah noticed my hesitation. "What's wrong?" she asked, her smile fading. "Probably nothing," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just thought I locked the door, that's all." We entered cautiously. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place, but then I noticed another piece of paper on the kitchen table. My heart sank as I picked it up and read, "This is your second warning. Next time we won't be so nice." Sarah arched over my shoulder, her face paling. "What's going on?" she whispered. "Who left this?" I had to tell her about the first note. Then, as I explained, I could see the fear growing in her eyes, mirroring my own rising panic. "We should leave," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Pack up and go home." Part of me agreed with her, but another part, a stubborn, angry part, didn't want to be chased away from our vacation by some unseen threat. "Let's not overreact," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It's probably just some locals trying to scare us off. We'll be more careful, keep the doors locked. If it happens again, we'll leave." "Okay." Sarah hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. We spent the rest of the day in the cabin, jumping at every sound. That night, neither of us slept well, taking turns to keep watch. The next morning, we woke to find our car's tires slashed. Any doubts about the seriousness of our situation vanished in that moment. This wasn't a prank or a misunderstanding. Someone wanted us gone, and they were escalating. "We need to call for help," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, we were miles from the nearest cell tower. The landline in the cabin was dead too. "Okay," I said, trying to think clearly through the rising panic. "Okay, we can't drive out. The nearest town is too far to walk, but there's a ranger station about 5 miles down the mountain. If we start now, we can make it there before dark." We packed quickly, taking only what we could easily carry. As we were about to leave, we found another note pinned to the door. "You had your chance now. You paid." The hike down the mountain was tense. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made us freeze. Were we being watched? Followed the beautiful forest that had seemed so welcoming just days ago now. Felt oppressive, full of hidden threats. We were about halfway to the ranger station when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of an engine. Someone was coming up the road. Help, Sarah shouted, running towards the sound. We need help, I ran after her, relief flooding through me. But as the vehicle came into view, that relief turned to ice. In my veins, it wasn't a ranger truck or a passing tourist. It was a battered old pickup, and the two men inside didn't look friendly. Sarah, run, I yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her off the road. We plunged into the forest, the shouts of the men and the roar of the truck's engine close behind. We ran blindly, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the panic of flight, but eventually the sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by our own labored breathing and pounding hearts. We found ourselves in a small clearing, both of us gasping for air. What do we do now? Sarah asked between breaths. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The sun was getting low. We've been running for hours. We can't go back to the road, I said. They'll be looking for us there. We need to keep moving. Try to circle around to the ranger station. As night fell, the forest became a different world. Shadows seemed to move, and every sound was magnified. We stumbled on using the stars to try to keep our direction. But I knew we were lost. We were exhausted, scared, and starting to lose hope when we saw it, a faint light through the trees. Cautiously, we approached. It was a small cabin, smoke rising from its chimney. For a moment, we hesitated. What if this was then the people who had been threatening us? But we were out of options. We needed help. I knocked on the door, my heart in my throat. After a long moment, it opened to reveal an old man, his weathered face creased with confusion. Please, I said, my voice hoarse. We need help. Someone's after us. The old man's expression changed from confusion to concern. He ushered us inside, locking the door behind us. As Sarah and I collapsed into chairs, he busied himself making tea and calling the ranger station on a crackling radio. Over the next hour, we told him our story. He listened, gravely nodding, as if this wasn't the first time he'd heard such a tale. You're not the first, he said. When we finished, there's a group around here don't like outsiders, think these mountains belong to them. They've scared off plenty of folks over the years. But why? Sarah asked. Why do they care if people visit? The old man shrugged. Some say they're protecting the land, others think they're hiding something. Truth is, no one really knows. We spent the night at the old man's cabin, too exhausted and relieved to worry about the propriety of it. In the morning, rangers arrived to escort us back to town. As we drove away from the mountains, I couldn't help but look back. The forest was as beautiful as ever in the morning light, but now I knew the darkness that could lurk in even the most picturesque places. We never returned to those mountains, but the experience changed us. We became more cautious, more aware of the potential dangers that can hide behind beautiful facades, but it also showed us our strength, our ability to face fear and survive. Now, years later, when I see a secluded cabin advertised online, I feel a mix of emotions. A part of me still longs for that peace and solitude, but I also remember the terror of those days, the realization that sometimes isolation can be as much a trap as a refuge. We still travel, still seek out beautiful remote places, but we do it with open eyes, aware that even in the most idyllic settings there can be shadows, and we're stronger for it, ready to face whatever challenges come our way. Together, the moment we realized all the trails back to civilization had been blocked or disguised, I knew our casual hiking trip had turned into a nightmarish game of survival. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly we'd be fighting for our lives against an unseen enemy in the wilderness. We once thought we knew it was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just me and my three best friends, Mike, Sarah, and Alex, taking advantage of the perfect fall weather to explore some new trails in the Appalachian Mountains. We've been planning this trip for months, poring over maps and excitedly discussing the spectacular views we'd encountered the first day. Was everything we'd hoped, for the weather was crisp and clear, the fall foliage painting the mountains in brilliant hues of red, orange, and gold. We hiked for hours, our spirits high, stopping often to take photos and marvel at the beauty surrounding us. As the sun began to set, we found a perfect spot to set up camp for the night, sitting around at the campfire that evening, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. I felt a deep sense of contentment. This was why we came out here, to escape the chaos of our daily lives and reconnect with nature and each other. If only I'd known then how quickly things would change. The first sign that something was wrong came early the next morning. I woke before the others and decided to take a short walk to stretch my legs. As I moved through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest seemed too quiet, the usual morning chorus of birds noticeably absent. Then I saw it, a flash of movement in the underbrush. I froze, straining my eyes to see what had caught my attention. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure ducking behind a tree, but when I blinked, there was nothing there. Unsettled, I hurried back to our campsite. The others were just starting to stir, and I debated whether to mention what I'd seen, not wanting to alarm them over what was probably just my imagination. I kept quiet. We packed up camp and set off, planning to hike to a nearby ridge known for its stunning vistas. But as we walked, that feeling of unease grew stronger. More than once, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, certain we were being watched. It was Mike who first said it out loud. "Guys," he said, it's his voice tight, "does anyone else feel like we're being followed?" The relief I felt at hearing someone else voice my concerns was short-lived. As we all stopped to listen, the forest around us seemed to hold its breath. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the pounding of my own heart. That's when we heard it, a twig snapping somewhere off to our left. We all whirled towards the sound, but there was nothing to see but trees and shadows. "It's probably just an animal," Sarah said, but her voice quavered with uncertainty. We picked up our pace, the carefree atmosphere of the morning evaporating in an instant. As we walked, we found ourselves clustering closer together, our eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for any sign of movement. It was early afternoon when we realized we'd made a terrible mistake. In our haste and growing paranoia, we veered off the main trail without noticing. We found ourselves in a part of the forest none of us recognized. "No problem," Alex said, pulling out his GPS. "We'll just backtrack to the main trail." But as we tried to retrace our steps, we made a chilling discovery. The path we'd taken seemed to have vanished, obscured by fallen branches and disturbed undergrowth. It was as if someone had deliberately tried to erase our trail. Panic started to set in as we realized the implication: someone was out there, and they didn't want us to leave. We spent the next few hours trying to find our way back to a marked trail, any trail, but every path we took seemed to lead us deeper into the wilderness. Worse, we kept finding signs that we weren't alone: strange markings on trees, small piles of stones that seemed too deliberate to be natural. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, we were forced to accept a terrifying truth: we were lost, and someone out there wanted us to stay that way. We made camp that night in a small clearing, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. Nobody spoke much as we set up the tents, each of us lost in our own fears. We decided to take turns keeping watch, none of us willing to risk being caught off guard. I took the first watch, sitting with my back against a tree, straining my ears for any sound out of place. The hours crawled by, each rustle of leaves making me flinch. It was near the end of my shift when I saw it, a light flickering between the trees. At first, I thought I was imagining things, my tired mind playing tricks on me, but no, there it was again, definitely real and definitely moving. I woke the others, and we huddled together watching as the light weaved through the trees. It seemed to be circling our camp, never coming too close. but never straying too far. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. "We can't stay here," Mike said. "They know where we are. We need to move." It was a terrible idea trying to navigate the unfamiliar forest in the dark, but the alternative, waiting to see what our unseen watchers had planned, was worse. We packed up as quietly as we could and set off using only the dim light of the moon to guide us. The going was slow and treacherous, every step a potential twisted ankle, or worse. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when we heard voices calling out in the darkness behind us. They were still distant, but clearly searching and getting closer. Panic let us speed, and we started to run. I lost track of how long we fled through the dark forest, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. The voices behind us grew louder, then faded, then grew loud again. They were toying with us, I realized with a chill, like cats playing with mice. Just when I thought we couldn't go on, when my lungs were burning and my legs felt like lead, we burst out of the tree line onto a dirt road. For a moment, we all stood there gasping for breath and staring at this unexpected sign of civilization. "Which way?" Alex panted. I looked both ways down the road, trying to orient myself. That's when I saw the headlight in the distance coming our way. Relief flooded through me. "Here!" I shouted, waving my arms. "Over here!" But as the vehicle got closer, that relief turned to ice in my veins. It wasn't the police or a park ranger. It was a battered old pickup truck, and the men inside didn't look friendly. "I run!" Mike yelled, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her back towards the trees. We plunged back into the forest. The shout of the men and the roar of the truck's engine close behind. We ran blindly, no longer caring about direction or stealth. Our only thought to put distance between us and our pursuers. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the panic of flight, but eventually the sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by our own labored breathing and pounding hearts. We found ourselves at the edge of a steep ravine, a river churning far below. We were trapped. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I looked at the others, saw the fear and exhaustion in their faces. "We were out of options. We have to cross," I said, pointing to a fallen tree that spanned the ravine. "It's our only chance." The crossing was terrifying. The logs swayed beneath our feet, slick with moss and rot. One misstep would mean a fatal plunge into the rapids below, but fear of what lurked behind us was greater than our fear of falling. Somehow, we all made it across. On the other side, we found a small cave hidden behind a curtain of vines. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. We huddled in that cave for what felt like days, taking turns to keep watch. We could hear our pursuers sometimes shouting to each other as they searched, but they never found our hiding place. It was on the third day that we heard the helicopter. At first we were afraid to hope, but when we saw search and rescue emblazoned on its side, we knew we were saved. The aftermath was a blur of police statements and media attention. We learned that we weren't the first to be targeted by this group of mountain dwellers who viewed outsiders as trespassers to be eliminated, but we were the first to escape and tell the tale. In the months that followed, as we tried to process what had happened, we found ourselves dealing with a mix of emotions: relief at having survived, certainly, but also a lingering fear, a new awareness of the dangers that can lurk in even the most beautiful places. It took time, but eventually we all found our way back to the trails. Our first hike after the incident was tense, every snapping twig making us jump, but as we walked, feeling the sun on our faces and the earth beneath our feet, we remembered why we loved this so much in the first place. The wilderness had shown us its darker side, yes, but it had also shown us our own strength, our resilience. We'd faced real danger and come out the other side, and in doing so we gained a deeper appreciation for the wild places of the world, their beauty, their challenges, and the profound effect they can have on the human spirit. Now, when I stand at a trailhead, I feel a mix of excitement and respect. The forest is not just a playground but a place of mystery and potential danger. And yet, I'm drawn to it more than ever because I know that out there among the trees and mountains, I'll find not just adventure, but a truer version of myself. The moment I realized the isolated camp was actually a trap, I knew my routine. Investigation had turned into a fight for survival. What I didn't expect was how quickly I'd become the prey in a deadly game orchestrated by those I was meant to protect. I'd been a park ranger for over a decade patrolling the vast wilderness of Yellowstone National Park. I thought I'd seen it all: lost hikers, aggressive wildlife, even the occasional illegal camper, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that fateful day in late September. The call came in early morning. Reports of strange activity deep in the backcountry. Hikers had mentioned seeing smoke where no campsite should be and eerie noises in the night. It wasn't unusual for people to get spooked in the wilderness, but something about this report nagged at me. I decided to check it out myself. I set out just as the sun was rising. The crisp autumn air filled with the scent of pine and with smoke. The location was remote, a good day hike from the nearest marked trail. As I made my way through the dense forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods were too quiet, the usual chatter of birds and small animals noticeably absent. It was late afternoon when I finally spotted the thin trail of smoke rising above the trees. I approached cautiously. Years of training kicking in. The camp came into view, a crude assemblage of tents and makeshift shelters, but something wasn't right. There were no people visible, no sounds of activity. I announced my presence, identifying myself as a ranger. The only response was the whisper of wind through the trees. Slowly, I entered the camp, my hand resting near my sidearm. The place lived in embers still glowed in a fire pit, and half-eaten meals lay abandoned on rough HED tables. It was as if everyone had suddenly vanished. That's when I saw the first body. He was partially hidden behind a tent down in the dirt. I rushed over, hoping against hope that he was just unconscious. But as I rolled him over, I recoiled in horror. His face was contorted in a grotesque mask of pain, eyes wide and staring, and there on his neck were two small puncture marks. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This was no animal attack I'd ever encountered. And where were the others? The camp was clearly set up for at least a dozen people. I keyed my radio, intending to call for backup, but all I got was static. Something was jamming the signal. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was alone out here, cut off from any help. A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, drawing my weapon in one smooth motion, but there was nothing there, just shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I needed to get out of there to report what I'd found and bring in a full team. But as I turned to leave, I saw them, figures moving at the edge of the camp, partially hidden by the gathering gloom. They were human in shape, but something about their movements was off, too fluid, too predatory. "This is Ranger Mike Sullivan," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Identify yourselves." A low chuckle was the only response seeming to come from all around me. Then a voice, raspy and cold. "Welcome, Ranger. We've been expecting you." My blood ran cold. This was no ordinary missing persons case. I was dealing with something far more sinister. I ran. There was no shame in it, no hesitation. Every instinct screamed at me to get away, to put as much distance between myself and whatever was in that camp. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step behind me. I could hear them in pursuit. They moved with an unnatural speed and grace, effortlessly keeping pace despite the difficult terrain. And all the while that chilling laughter echoed through the trees. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the blind panic of flight. but eventually I burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. In the center stood an old fire tower, its metal frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. With no other options, I made for the tower. The rusted ladder creaked ominously under my weight as I climbed my pursuer's footsteps. Growing ever closer, I reached the small room at the top, slamming the hatch shut behind me and securing it with a rusty chain I found in the corner. For a moment, all was quiet. I stood there gasping for breath, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. Then came a thud from below, followed by another. They were climbing the tower. I looked around frantically for anything I could use. As a weapon, the room was bare save for an old desk and chair and a dusty first aid kit hanging on the wall. I grabbed the chair, ready to fight for my life. If they breached the hatch, the thuds grew louder. Closer, the hatch shuddered as something heavy slammed into it from below. The chain held, but I didn't know for how long. As I stood there, heart pounding, a memory surfaced, an old legend I'd heard around the ranger station, stories of creatures that lurked in the deepest parts of the wilderness, preying on unsuspecting hikers. I'd always dismissed them as campfire tales meant to scare rookies. Now I wasn't so sure. Another slam against the hatch, and I saw the metal begin to buckle. Whatever was down there, it was strong, inhumanly strong. In desperation, I turned to the first aid kit inside. I found the usual supplies: bandages, antiseptic, and a small silver cross that someone had left behind. On a hunch, I grabbed the cross, its weight oddly comforting in my hand. The hatch burst open with a screech of torture. Metal, a figure pulled itself up, movements fluid and unnaturally fast. In the dim light, I caught a glimpse of pale skin, elongated canines, and eyes that glowed with an unholy hunger. Without thinking, I thrust the silver cross forward. The effect was immediate and shocking. The creature recoiled with a screech of pain, smoke rising from where the silver had touched its flesh. Taking advantage of its momentary distraction, I charged forward, pushing with all my might. The creature caught off balance, tumbled back through the hatch. I heard a series of thuds and inhuman shrieks as it fell down the tower. I slammed the hatch shut again, securing it as best I could with a mangled chain, but I knew it wouldn't hold for long. I was trapped with no way down save for a 100-T drop. As if in answer to my desperate thoughts, a new sound cut through the night, the rhythmic thud of helicopter blades. A searchlight swept the area, momentarily blinding me. As it passed over the tower, hope surged through me. Someone had noticed I was missing and sent out a search party, but would they reach me in time? The creatures below seemed agitated by the noise and light. I could hear them snarling, their inhuman voices carrying clearly in the night air. The hatch shuddered again as they renewed their assault. The helicopter drew closer, its searchlight zeroing in on the tower. I waved frantically, shouting at the top of my lungs, "Please let them see me, let them understand I'm in danger." Just as the hatch began to give way, a rope ladder dropped from the hovering helicopter. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled out onto the tower's small balcony and grabbed the ladder, my feet leaving the platform just as pale hands reached through the opening. As I was pulled to safety, I looked down. The creatures had emerged onto the balcony, their faces twisted in fury. As their prey escaped, the searchlight illuminated them fully for the first time, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. They were human once, but no longer. Whatever they were now, it was something ancient, something that should not exist in our world. The debriefing that followed was surreal. My story was met with disbelief and concern for my mental state. No bodies were found at the camp, no evidence of the creatures I'd encountered, if not for the scratches on my arms and the battered silver cross I still clutched. I might have believed I'd imagined the whole thing. In the end, the official report cited an unknown animal attack and hallucinations brought on by stress and possible exposure to toxic plants. But I knew the truth, and I knew that somewhere out there in the deep wilderness, they were still waiting, watching, hungry I still work as a ranger. Someone needs to be out there aware of the real dangers that lurk in the shadows, but I no longer patrol alone. And I never enter the back country without a silver cross around my neck. The wilderness holds many secrets, some beautiful, some terrifying. That day I glimpsed something that shook my understanding of the world, and while part of me wishes I could forget, a larger part knows that ignorance is not bliss, it's vulnerability. So I watch and I wait and I hope that I'm prepared for the day when the creatures of the night decide to venture once more into the world of light. The moment I saw the silhouette standing just beyond the glow of my campfire, I knew my peaceful solo camping trip had taken a sinister turn. What I didn't realize was how quickly it would spiral into a terrifying game of cat and mouse in the wilderness. I once thought I knew I'd always been a bit of a loner, finding more solace in the quiet of nature than in the chaos of city life. That's why I decided to take a week-long camping trip in the Adra, just me, my gear, and the great outdoors. I'd found a perfect spot miles from any marked trails or campsites where I could truly disconnect and recharge. The first few days were blissful. I spent my time hiking, taking photos of the stunning landscape, and enjoying the simple pleasure of being alone with my thoughts. Each night, I'd return to my campsite, cook a simple meal over my portable stove, and fall asleep to the gentle sounds of the forest. It was on the fourth day that things started to feel off. I'd gone for a long hike, pushing myself further than I had on previous days. When I returned to my camp exhausted and ready to relax, I noticed something strange. My tent zipper was partially open. I was certain I'd closed it fully before leaving that morning. A chill ran down my spine as I approached cautiously inside. Things seemed undisturbed at first glance, but as I looked closer, I realized items had been moved. My sleeping bag was slightly askew, and my backpack wasn't where I'd left it. Someone had been in my tent. I stood there for a moment, heart racing, unsure what to do. Should I pack up and leave? But it was already late afternoon, and I was miles from anywhere. The thought of hiking out in the dark was not appealing. I decided to stay but sleep with my hunting knife close at hand. That night, every snapping twig and rustling leaf had me on edge. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at the slightest sound. The next morning, I woke to find my boots, which I'd left outside the tent, moved several feet away. This was no animal. Someone was deliberately messing with me. I spent the day hiking nearby, partly to clear my head and partly to see if I could spot any signs of another campsite, but the woods seemed empty save for the usual wildlife. As evening approached, I reluctantly returned to my camp. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by a tree. My heart leapt into my throat. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone there?" No response. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward, and in that instant, they vanished into the shadows of the forest. I ran to where they had been standing, but there was no sign anyone had been there. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat by my fire, knife in hand, jumping at every sound. As the flames died down to embers, I saw it again, a dark silhouette standing just beyond the fading circle of light, watching me. I stood up quickly, brandishing my knife. "Who's there? What do you want?" Again, no response, but this time the figure didn't disappear. It just stood there unnaturally still. In that moment, fear gave way to anger. I was tired of being toyed with. I charged forward, determined to confront whoever or whatever was tormenting me. But as I reached the spot where the figure had been, there was nothing. I spun around, searching the darkness, but I was alone, or so I thought. A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled to see the figure now standing where I had been moments ago, though next to my dying fire. How had they moved so quickly? And silently, panic surged through me. This was no ordinary person. I ran blindly into the forest, no longer caring about direction or stealth. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed Through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Finally, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. The forest was silent save for my pounding heart and heaving breaths. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized I had no idea where I was. In my panic, I'd left everything behind: my tent, my supplies, even my flashlight. I was lost in the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on my back and my hunting knife. I spent the night huddled at the base of a large tree, shivering in the cool mountain air. Every sound had me flinching, expecting to see that silent figure emerging from the shadow. But nothing came. As dawn broke, I tried to orient myself. The rising sun gave me a general sense of direction, but I had no idea how far I'd run or which way would lead me back to civilization. I picked a direction and started walking, hoping to find a trail or a road. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly. Thirst clawed at my throat and hunger gnawed at my stomach. But worse than the physical discomfort was the constant fear. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see that figure standing there watching silently. It was late afternoon when I heard it, the sound of running water. Hope surged through me. As I quickened my pace, I burst through a line of trees to find a small stream gurgling over rocks. I fell to my knees, cupping the cool water in my hands and drinking deeply. As I straightened up, wiping my mouth, I froze. There on the opposite bank stood the figure, even in broad daylight. I couldn't make out any features. It was as if the shadows clung to it, obscuring any details. We stood there facing each other across the stream. I gripped my knife tightly, though I knew it would be useless if the figure could move as quickly as it had before. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice horror from thirst and fear. For the first time the figure moved. It raised an arm pointing downstream. Then, in a blink, it was gone. I stood there for several minutes, unsure what to do. Was this another trick? But I had no better options. Cautiously, I began to follow the stream in the direction the figure had indicated. As the sun began to set, I heard something that made my heart leap: the distant sound of voices, human voices. I quickened my pace, hope lending strength to my tired legs. I burst out of the tree line onto a small road. A group of hikers stood there, looking startled at my sudden appearance. I must have been quite a sight: clothes torn, face scratched, wild-eyed with fear and exhaustion. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, taking a step towards me. The story poured out of me in a rush: the tampering with my campsite, the silent figure, my panicked flight through the forest. As I spoke, I saw the hikers exchange worried glances. They took me to the nearest ranger station, where I repeated my story to increasingly skeptical faces. The rangers organized a search of the area where I'd been camping, but found no evidence of an intruder. My tent and gear were there undisturbed. There were no unexplained footprints, no sign that anyone else had been in the area. In the end, they chalked it up to an overactive imagination fueled by isolation and possible dehydration. They were kind about it, but I could see they didn't believe me. As I sat in the back of a ranger truck being driven back to civilization, I couldn't shake the memory of that silent, shadowy figure. Had it all been in my mind a hallucination brought on by stress and solitude? But then I remembered how it had pointed downstream, leading me to safety. If it was just a figment of my imagination, how could it have guided me out of the wilderness? I never returned to those with the experience left me shaking, questioning what I thought I knew about the world and myself. But it also taught me something important. The wilderness, like life itself, holds mysteries we may never fully understand. It can be beautiful and terrifying, peaceful and dangerous, often all at once. Now, years later, I still feel drawn to the outdoors, but I no longer seek total solitude. Instead, I've learned to appreciate the balance between isolation and connection, between adventure and safety. And sometimes on dark nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I remember that silent figure And I wonder if somewhere in the deep woods it's still out there watching, waiting a guardian, or a threat, a protector, or a predator. Perhaps in the end it's both. The moment we heard the unmistakable sound of machinery coming. Subscribe and like video for 4.